Good morning, everyone. As everyone is joining, thank you so very much for joining us today. I'm just doing a quick go through to see how many folks we have. But welcome everyone to our training opportunity today. And before we get started into our slide deck, it is a great opportunity to introduce myself and my co-trainer, who is amazing, and you're going to have an amazing time the next few days that we are together. And my name is Dr. Dolores Blackwell. I'm a licensed clinical social worker here in the state of New York and a few other spaces and places. And I work with ATTC and a few other projects that you'll be hearing about throughout our time together over the next 3 days. And I'm going to turn it over to Miss Diana Padilla.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Nice to see you all here. I'm Diane Padilla. I am a research project manager at Northeast and Caribbean Addiction Technology Transfer Center. Boy, it never gets old. It's such a mouthful every single time I say it. So I love acronyms, so please bear with me. In my capacity, I am a senior trainer for the Training Institute. I also work for the Prevention TTC, the Opioid Response Network. I'm the expert technical assistance implementation specialist, and a lot of hats in between, just like you folks.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to getting to know those of you who I haven't seen in a while, and those of you who are new to.
So thank you, Diana. So today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to start our opportunity with, we're going to start today, and we're going to start from 9:30 to 1:30, and we'll be doing Wednesday and Friday from 9:30 to 1:30. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to do just to start us off. Is one, ask for folks to please type their name in the chat. Okay, in the chat function, please type your name in the chat. Type the name that you registered with. And if there's more than one person sharing the computer, we ask that you please type your name or both names or however many other folks are sharing the computer. Okay, so I am going to share my slide deck and I'm going to walk us through some housekeeping things that we need to cover. As I'm seeing folks are amazingly typing their name in and also typing good morning to everyone, which is amazing. So I'm going to share the slide deck. So give me 2 seconds. Let me do that. There we go. Okay. So of course, we have to get to the housekeeping things. So lean into just kind of hearing that information. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a certificate of completion, which everyone, of course, is interested in receiving. So the thing is that in order for you to get a certificate of completion, you have to attend all 3 sessions, okay? All 3 sessions. So that's why it's Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 9:30 to 1:30. And you will need to complete an online evaluation at the end of the 3rd session, okay? At the end of the 3rd session. And certificates will be sent out within a week or so, along with a copy of the slide decks, right? So you can stay present in the moment because you will receive the slide decks at a later time, okay? This webinar is approved for 15 hours of KSAC, CP, CPS credentialing, and you must be able to visually attend all 3 sessions in their entirety and complete the assignments. Now, you will receive a series of pre-assignments. You received one earlier before you registered. You'll also receive pre-assignments and other things that you'll need to complete throughout the training, okay? So please make sure that you complete those. Also, we ask that you have your cameras on. I know that sometimes it could be a little difficult because folks are in different places and spaces, but we ask for folks to have their cameras on so that when we're communicating with each other, when you're communicating with each other also, we can see who you are, okay? The other thing is this particular webinar, the development of these training materials was supported by a grant or an opportunity or funding from the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment and SAMHSA and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. But the contents, while this training was developed using that grant or a part of that grant, the contents are solely the responsibility of the Northeast Caribbean and Addiction Technology Transfer Center, or ATTC, which is an amazing resource for free opportunities like this, okay? And does not necessarily represent the official views of SAMHSA. So the purposes of SAMHSA's technology transfer centers is to really develop and strengthen specialized behavioral health and primary health care for workforce that provides substance use disorder and mental health prevention, treatment, and recovery support services. And we help people and organizations incorporate effective practices in regards to substance use and mental health prevention, treatment, and recovery services. Okay. So I'm going to ask for Diana to talk a little bit more. I talked a little bit about what ATTC does, but there are other opportunities that you may want to avail yourself of as well. So Diana, can you talk a little bit about MHTTC and PTTC?
Well, building off of what you just covered in the previous line, and just so everybody know, these TTCs are just SAMHSA's response to workforce support needs, development needs. And so it's not just the addiction track that SAMHSA supports, they also have the disciplines of mental health, the prevention and treatment and recovery supports is also supported. And so you see that one umbrella, and SAMHSA is really supporting all these TTCs and these regions from across the country. There's at least 10 for under each discipline that you see here. And we're a free resource across the country. That's just SAMHSA's way of saying, we know you're doing all the hard work, working directly with the client community. And so we're trying to provide you with all the latest information and accredited knowledge and skill sets that you need to keep your licenses and other credentials.
Thank you, Diana. So there's some kind of language that we need to be very thoughtful about in regards to this in any webinar that we're attending, etc. So really ATTC really leans into the premise of the use of affirming language because it inspires hope and advances recovery. So really thinking about the concept that language matters. And this is something that all of you are familiar with who've been working in the field, right? Words have power. And so we lean into the premise that people first. So we use affirming language to promote the promises of recovery by advancing evidence-based and culturally informed practices, okay? And so just want to lean into some visual platform logistics that we need to lean into for the purposes of today. So one, I ask that each person type their name that they use to register for this opportunity in the chat function. I wanted to kind of go back to the chat function for a second because the chat function, while it is a function that we utilize as an opportunity to see where people are landing when we ask questions, etc. It's also an opportunity for you to build an additional level of community in this space, okay? An additional level of community. So there may be times that you respond to things or things that have really resonated for you. You can feel free to share it in the chat. You can also communicate with each other in the chat. You can also just kind of utilize it as a space for an additional part of this community, okay? Because we do recognize that we may be leaning into some material and talking about some things that may activate folks in a variety of different ways, all right? So we just want to make sure that you have that additional space. Also, folks may not feel necessarily comfortable in verbalizing certain things, so you can use the chat function as an opportunity, okay? Also, the other thing with this visual platform logistics, right, because we're on Zoom, is as you noticed, each person, when they came into the space, was muted, okay? You'll need to keep yourself on mute unless you're responding to something or you have a question, etc. And so once you do that and you respond, etc., please remember to remute yourself. Also, raise your hand function, right? At the bottom of the screen, you have an opportunity to raise your hand. Now, the thing is with the raise your hand function, it flashes pretty quickly, right? So we're going to try to monitor that. We have a number of folks in the space today, so we want to be honor as many folks as possible if you raise your hand. So just being thoughtful around raising your hand through the feature, but recognizing we may need to just ask folks, did anyone raise their hand? Was there anyone who had any further responses, etc.? Because we want to make sure we get to as many folks as possible. Muting and unmuting, I also discussed. Breakout rooms, if we use breakout rooms throughout our 3 days together, remembering that breakout rooms, you'll be shifted to a breakout room, or I like to call them pods, and remember which breakout room you're located in, okay? So just being thoughtful around that. If by happenstance anything happens throughout the training opportunity, let's say, for example, your computer dies, let's say your camera goes down, your speaker goes off, etc. Let us know through the chat function, okay? Let us know through the chat function. It might be that we might be able to assist you on our end, but we also recognize that folks are coming in from a variety of places and spaces, and we know with technology that sometimes things do happen. So let us know so that we can try to attempt to assist you as best we can, okay? Also, camera and visual participation. We ask again that everyone have their cameras on with the recognition that everyone is in different places and spaces. And so keeping your visual contact is an incredibly important part of this learning opportunity. And also we ask that folks participate. While we may have a large number of folks who are in this space today, right? Participation is about being present, being here. Okay, so we do understand that folks have other things that may be happening, but being present in the space, okay, through not just your physical presence, but also your mental presence as well. Because again, we're going to be leaning into some very challenging and very interesting topics throughout our time together. And so you being present and being aware and being connected is going to be incredibly important. So going over again, the title of our opportunity today is Cultural Humility and Cultural Competence. And again, this is a journey to improved outcomes. And so there are some disclaimers that I do need to lean into so that everyone is aware. And this is something that we'll revisit each day, okay, each day that we are together. And so the first thing we want to say is that this is not a clinical training. And we will not delve deeply into clinical practices, concepts, or processes beyond the cultural competent considerations associated with them, okay? So we want to be clear that this is not a clinical training. Also, this is the beginning or the start or maybe the continuation of a journey. So you will not be culturally competent after completing this training. For some of folks, some of this information will feel very familiar. Some folks, this may be a reminder. Some folks, this may be brand new information. But this is a journey to outcomes, right? Not the end of the journey, okay? There absolutely will be unfinished business after this training that will require you to really lean in and do some further learning and research and maybe attend other webinars and trainings and do readings, etc. So really being okay with there may be a level of uncertainty of what are the next steps, that you need to take next steps, etc. And being okay with the concept of unfinished business. The personal truth expressed in these trainings by the facilitator, myself and Ms. Padilla, and the training participants are their truths, right? They are their truths. And so respectively, as they have experienced life, that must be met with respect. What might be true for myself, might be true for other participants in this space, may not be for other folks, okay? But that being present and being open is incredibly important, okay? Being present to hear experiences that may be different from yours, be present to hear experience that might be similar to yours, and just being there and just being with us along in this journey, or along with us in this journey. The service population or population of focus, while we call them a number of different things in a variety of spaces and places, will be universally in this opportunity referred to as clients, okay? We're going to use that universal word as clients. But if you're using service providers, consumers, etc., it is this, we're connecting all of that under the umbrella of clients, okay? And also just kind of reminding folks that try not to be caught up in politically correct or sanctioned language for certain field terms, okay? We may use common language using communities of service population or in communities of service of the service population, which may not necessarily be technical terms. So we want to kind of talk about this in a very universal language, and just being thoughtful around the technicality is not what we're leaning into here. We're talking about leaning into really leaning, those cultural competence considerations, okay? So there's some other things that we want to be aware of and kind of laying some ground freedoms or ground spaces or group norms, or how, the number of different names that we can contact them, but we'll call them ground rules. So one of the things I leaned into a little while ago is to listen to each other and respect our differences, right? We may not agree with folks, but we can agree to disagree, okay? Just kind of respecting each other's differences, listening and hearing folks out, and potentially agree to disagree. The other thing that we also want to lean into is the speaking from self, using I statements, okay? Using statements will be incredibly important throughout this process. And also what's said in this virtual room stays in this virtual room, right? So this is about creating a safe space where folks feel safe to express thoughts, ideas, and things that they might be encountering on their own journey, okay? And everyone makes an agreement or agrees to make an effort to contribute honestly and to share and deal with feelings in a positive manner or positive fashion. We also expect unfinished business as we ended, as I mentioned before, and using the safety word ouch when the conversation is activating or you're feeling overwhelmed. Also, I want to add the additional piece that when you have that ouch moment and you feel like you need to take a break for a second or a few minutes just to kind of gather your thoughts, ground yourself, etc., please feel free to do so, because this hopefully is a safe space for everyone. But we also recognize that, again, some of this material can activate folk. So just want to be thoughtful around that. This is designated as a safe space. And so this place is a place where all voices and all participants have value and are seen as valid. So before all, we'll also find a few other house rules that will add into this, or, rules that will maintain the safety and integrity of the space. So we want to be aware of the use of isms and no isms being present in this space. So no racism, no sexism, ableism, no ageism, sizeism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, or fat phobia. Kind of leaving that outside of this space, okay? No hate, okay? And everyone is asked to practice active listening, okay? When we talk about active listening, it's leaning into what am I hearing, okay? And just kind of being present, which is the art of listening to others with the intent to understand instead of waiting for how or when it's your turn to speak, okay? And that goes back to being present. It's important to ask everyone what each other's preferred gender pronouns are, okay? And we encourage everyone to speak from I, okay? When giving an opinion, when responding to something, use of I statements or in my experiences. Also, the other thing is, while we may be covering some very challenging, and when I use the word challenging, I use the word challenging. Challenging can be positive or it can be negative, right? But I use it as a catch-all frame. I tend to go with the word positive because challenges are something that we're pushing against, that we're leaning into, okay? And so please don't be afraid to ask questions throughout our opportunity together, because there's some things that you may need to check in with, or some things that you may think about when you leave the opportunity today, and tomorrow, or not tomorrow, or Wednesday, when you come back, you say, hey, I just wanted to check in on something that was covered in the last opportunity, and just wanted to kind of lean into that a little bit more, okay? So our suggested topics, or what we'll be covering today, is, of course, what is cultural or why cultural competence, terms and definitions, implicit bias. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick introduction to cultural competence. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my share for a moment, and I'm going to ask folks, when you registered for this particular opportunity, what were some of the things you were thinking about when you registered for it? And let me be clear, what were some of the things you were thinking about besides getting the credits, okay? What were some of the things that connected for you? Some of the things you're hoping to hear about? Okay, so Someone mentioned in the chat, understanding others. Great. Jaren, you raised your hand. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, good morning. I,
Good
I
morning.
was curious about like different cultures and I knew that I thought that this program would be introducing us to different types of programs that different types of cultures that exist and the dynamic in that. So I was just curious about that.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Hopefully we meet that curiosity. Also, there is a lot of activity going on in the chat, okay? So I'm gonna ask Diana, can you chime in and read some of the responses from the chat?
Sure. So we have a few really great comments, really. Want to understand others, want to be open-minded. I appreciate the candidacy when it was mentioned that I am not sure I understand in its entirety and what cultural competence is, and ignorance is not acceptable. That says a lot. That is awesome. So
Mhm.
greater cultural competency understanding, understanding better how to, about the outcomes, social interaction tools, learning about evolving cultures, and awareness and where that relates to cultural diversity, and continue to learn about self and others. It looks like different components of some of the content that we are actually going to present. Thanks.
Awesome.
Great comments, everyone.
Awesome. We so appreciate when folks definitely lean in, and there's going to be a lot of opportunities to lean in through this conversation or our multiple conversations we'll be having over the next 3 days. Okay. So, what I'm going to do is I am now going to transition over to my co-trainer, Diana, who will be taking you through some very important information and leaning in more into cultural competence.
So my first question to you all, and before I just hit the slides, and I'll go to them in a second, but why is it important for you folks to get cultural competence trainings? And I'm going to make it more specific than that. Why is it important? Why is it always required for your credentials?
Because we serve a diverse population and we want to make sure and understand the needs that are being brought to the table.
Okay, so one training is not enough to achieve that?
No.
Okay, thank you. Joshua?
Cultural competency, can you hear me by any chance? It's a room of three
Yes.
of us. Okay. Cultural competency and trauma-informed care go together. And so I can't be trauma-informed if I'm not informed on the culture and being competent or at least aware of the population I serve. And so that's why you have to have courses like this available.
Very good, thank you. Christine, what would you like to add?
Sorry, I had to find the mute button. I want to say that he stole my answer, but in addition to that, it's not only for why is it important, is because we're seeing the people who come to us for help. It's being aware and being respectful of vast different cultures and this is just the beginning or the stepping stone. So it's helping us to be more aware. There might be a point, there might be a sentence, there might be an epiphany saying, I want to learn more about this. It might be personally diving into more cultural work. So that's represented in the clients or community that we serve.
Very good. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Christine. And appreciate all the comments. What's interesting is that you have some other comments here in the chat too about to be effective in working with others, provide services which are culturally sensitive. And we're going to take you through some terminology to evolve your understanding of what they actually mean. Because there's a difference between sensitivity and competency, and certainly proficiency. And so, and some of the terms will speak to how we can integrate, how those concepts can be applied in practice. And so it's great that you folks have mentioned all about the changing dynamics that tends to present with our client communities. I also want to suggest, and I'm going to encourage everyone to kind of borrow our ideas, just for at least the time that we're here together. Because the one thing I didn't hear very specifically about is also our perspectives. So there's a lot of diversity within the communities that we provide services to. There's also diversity in our thinking, and not just and it's not just, you know, cultural, racial, gender background. It's also how our thinking and how that applies, how that influences the different interactions that we have and so on. So hopefully, as this comes together for you, we're going to unpack this a little bit more. I like that, to continue to develop our self-awareness and be aware of our biases. Yeah. So everything that you folks have mentioned, we have something to speak to here. So it's great that you folks have kind of started us off. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. A chief financial officer that asked the chief executive officer, what happens if we invest in developing our people and then they leave us? And we know that that is a concern of different organizations and agencies. And how bad can that be, that when you do invest in your staff, that if they move on, they take their skills with them, that wherever they are going to go, that their evolved knowledge and their practice skills do tend to be practiced, at least working in the favor of client communities, at least ideally. The other thing was that the CEO said, what happens if we don't invest and they stay? And now that's the question that I wouldn't mind you including a comment in the chat. What if we do keep our staff, but we don't invest in their development? What is the potential trickle effect with the client communities, and also the effects on the client staff, on our staff itself? And so these are the things to consider, because when you think about the workforce is currently overwhelmed, understaffed, so certainly overworked. There was a HRSA, the Health Resources and Service Administration, released a publication out in December of 23, so just a few months ago, and taught and identified certain challenges within the behavioral health workforce that can really speak to someone's ability to meet the individual needs of different members of the community. And so we do, it has been acknowledged, and this has been a constant for a little while now, about the shortages in terms of mental health counselors, addiction counselors, family therapists and such. And there is a projection that this, that the understaffed workforce will continue like that into 2036. And so according to this report, so I thought that was pretty interesting. There's also high out-of-pocket costs and insurance coverage gaps for the client members, for the members themselves, for these clients and patients, forgive me. There's also rural counties also are more likely than urban counties to lack in behavioral health providers. We know that there is a challenge in accessing resources and having an availability of resources. Also, and so there, what you see is sometimes the behavioral health challenges that an individual or family may be having. They have a primary care to go to. They may take that to primary care. It's not necessarily the best resource for specific challenges for individuals. There is another interesting one that's very, very specific, very relevant to our time here together, is that the majority of the behavioral health workforce identifies as female and non-Hispanic white, and may not necessarily represent the communities that they are serving. So collectively, these different factors, and there's more listed in the report, but these kind of were the ones that stood out for me, that collectively these factors really impact our ability to have our staff be as developed and supported as much as possible, so they can provide the best services possible to the client community. And so we are going to go, so we're going to ask why cultural competence. Well, what I'm going to ask you all to consider is what other reasons, other than what I have here, what you might think would be the benefits of organizations becoming more culturally competent. And so the opportunities seem to come up with the diverse, be more diverse and inclusive in terms of hiring practices. The more diverse your staff, the more opportunities and for the communities that you're serving. Hi, Yvette, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Yeah, you know, one of the things that always stood out to me when I worked, because of the diversity of the clients, was It would be a perfect world if we could match each client with the right counselor, like, with the same kind of background or ethnic or sexual identity or whatever that is. But that's never going to happen. It's impossible for us because in a job, you don't have all the diversity. And each individual, you have, people that come in, they do the jobs, and we may not match with the clients. I've seen a lot of clients that felt, oh, how does that person understand me? Do they know where I come from, what I've been through? They know a lot of book smart, but do they really understand me? And that's something that it would be great if we could do more of that, like matching the clients to the staff members. But then some staff members will have 50,000 clients and another one will have two. So it's not going to happen. I understand all of that, but it would be nice to match us up as much as possible so that the client is more open to and receptive to change.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you, Yvette.
Yeah.
And that's so true. That was my experience as well when I was doing direct services. Is they kind of match you up with there are times where the effort is definitely there, and there are other times where certain staff are already overwhelmed and giving them another client that might be an appropriate, culturally appropriate match might be just overwhelming them the caseload. So they give it to the next person who has maybe one or two less, and we're not even going to talk about the logistics of caseloads and grants and all that. But yeah, ideally we want to match because that's one of the traditional components of culturally appropriate matching and that can certainly enhance the opportunities to be more responsive to the needs of the client community. Thank you, Yvette. That's a great point. So Tatiana, hi.
Hi, good morning, everyone. That made me think of just about like the profession of social services and mental health, just the high rates of burnout and agencies not putting like some thought or care into self-care for their employees. And sometimes when like a staff may speak one language, they connect like all those clients to that one specific case manager or social worker or anything like that.
This is true. And this is part of what's been going on in the field at this point. And because of the burnout, a lot of folks are starting to step away from the careers. And, people were retired actually being recruited back into the field. And so cultural competence provides a lot of opportunities for organizations, not just that staff can be more well-versed in cross-cultural communications and so on, but also it's an opportunity for organizations to enhance the environment to support the staff. Because burnout, because of compassion fatigue, and I know Doris can speak more to that, because of all the other dynamics that really stresses out the workforce. And then essentially, how can you present in a grounded manner or grounded as much as you can to be available to support someone else if you're not being supported as well. So the dynamics are really from different directions. Dolores, I saw you had nodding your head. Did you want to add?
No, because I could talk for hours just on compassion fatigue, and I do not want to hijack.
All right. We tag teaming here, folks. So, okay, so we're going to continue on. We do have a lot, and I appreciate that. But you are all speaking to the very different factors that are fluctuating at different times for different situations and different organizations and settings. And here I would stress very specifically that every setting, even though it may be a certain model, just like the next setting, there's a lot of autonomy in each setting. And so let's consider some of those dynamics as well. A doctor treating cancer does not have to have cancer to treat, and health. Book knowledge is very powerful. And it is. We just want to make sure that we evolve in as many components as we can for the community. So thank you for that, Sir Thurston. So let me show you the slides and let me just go through this. In terms of why cultural competence, and I asked you, why is it that you folks are required to have cultural competence training? OASIS is requesting that new addiction counselors with new PACE Act credentials, actually get 15 hours of cultural competence training. And we know that social workers, therapists, we know that everyone is typically required every few years to update their to have certain amount of training hours to maintain their credentials. And it has a lot to do with everything that you folks said, and I'm going to add to it, if you don't mind. There are when it comes to culture, when it comes to communities, the factors are not static. Individuals, human beings are not static. There are different things that are always moving in a different person's life, let alone a group's life. And so there's also, and there are other aspects to that too that we're going to cover. But in terms of the organization, it benefits the organization to have a diverse staff, a diverse, inclusive staff, because it presents more opportunities to be able to connect and be effective with the diverse communities that need our services. It's also a positive, the positive effect of infrastructure has to do with being able to, and this is where sometimes diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging trainings play a part, where it enhances the environment, but it also helps organizations, encourages organizations to look inside. It's like a cultural humility approach about looking inside and seeing what works and how policies and procedures and protocols can be enhanced or improved, or to be more responsive, culturally responsive to communities. It reduces healthcare disparities. The outcomes it's comprehensive. Just the title itself, cultural, is just very comprehensive in nature. So it encourages a comprehensive approach. Collectively, with different strategies and different levels of the organization, provider, and so on, it can actually help to reduce healthcare disparities and improve outcomes. And so we've been seeing disparities for a very long time. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. But we want to be able to improve access. We want to build or help systems to be more effective in terms of being able to respond more specifically to community needs. We always want to tailor service delivery that should meet. We still build on certain traditional concepts of meeting the individual where they're at. Those specific needs of the individual require a specifically tailored approach. And so that doesn't get old. That's just still part of what has been proven to be part of effective, successful outcomes. Understanding the needs of the communities, of the communities in need, but also the collaborative partnerships. None of us have to do anything alone. And I'm speaking to us as an organization, as an entity. We have other community resources that we can partner in, and collectively we can make an impact. So also access to services is huge. We know that, and we'll talk more about social determinants of health tomorrow, but access to services is not the same for everyone. Not everyone has the same opportunities. Not everyone has had the opportunities to achieve the same high level of standards in any particular realm of life. And so access to services alone can be very challenging for certain communities when certain dynamics are part of their reality in their world. So greater sense of safety, and I think I would have put that like earlier on. Safety is always key. I was always trained when working directly with community members that safety is like utmost or most important thing. For community members to feel safe enough so we can interact, so we can elicit information, so we can understand how to meet their needs is so important. Culture exploration and trauma, we're going to discuss this more, so I'm not going to go into it. Language accessibility, we do have this Office of Minority Health and out of HHS, they had created culturally and linguistically appropriate services standards, all in a way to help folks be more to understand how organizations can help enhance their environment and elevate their levels of language accessibility for different folks that they may need to provide services to. It's also about the human rights and every individual. When an individual is heard, individuals more likely to commit more into their recovery and wellness process than not. So we want to understand how that applies for any given person and in the service plans. So here I'm going to ask you one question. So this slide really should have been at the beginning of the training, but Dolores had asked you all to put your names inside the chat box. I'm also going to ask you, all of you as individuals, to respond to the last question. How do you culturally identify? And just include that in the chat box. And we're going to build upon that as we go along. Matter of fact, I'll put my own too. I'll put myself, and then you folks can follow suit. So how do you culturally identify? however that is. It could be many dimensions, it could be very simplistic, however you identify. Thank you, Edmelinda. Very cool. So as we go along, I'm going to build on those comments. So the next topic here that is here is it's an interesting saying. America is a melting pot where nothing melted. Now, back in the day, and I'm definitely dating myself, but when I was in grade school, this term was I was first exposed to it in grade school. And in history class, we were also, it was always stressed about the importance of understanding that the country has evolved and it was developed on backs of immigrants, immigrant populations, and it was a melting pot that helped this country evolve. And one of the things that today is that although the idea was more like it was almost like it's taking into account the cultural differences within the United States or America, that they come together to make this country what it is, to become but it kind of is not necessarily an accurate statement. It's somewhat outdated, and that's why we don't hear it as much anymore, because the core ideology here in this country is that it is a melting pot made up of different races, different communities, different populations, but our government very often do exclude different groups of migrants. And I'm talking about, and this has been since the colonization days, because when you think about this, look at what happened, with indigenous people, tribal nations. And so this is supposed to be a nation of immigrants, and yet it leaves out those who were here before colonization. It also doesn't necessarily include those who were brought here against their will. And I'm talking about when we took the Black community out of Africa. And I'm going to stop saying we, because I wasn't there. Nobody who's on this platform was there. But this is what happened as part of the colonization. And so when we think about a melting pot, are we actually attributing this reference, this term, to what is actually happening? But we're saying one thing, but yet we're excluding the populations. We are creating disparities amongst different populations. And so it says here that there's a mixture in which all the ethnic and cultural ingredients of various groups are tossed together while still remaining their unique flavor and taste. It's those unique ethnocultural flavors that make working with individuals today so fascinating yet so challenging. And I think this is where we come in. This is what we tend to see. We tend to see the distinctions between even similar situations, but how they are experienced by people from their cultural perspective, from their belief system. And so it just makes it so amazing. I've always thought that one of the things I used to think about, and that came from doing working with communities, was I always thought that every person was a world unto themselves. And I think, and I was trained back in the day to be able to tailor my approaches depending on the needs of that individual. So the practices, as some of the practices that we'll be talking to here in this training, will certainly be some strategies that you may be using, or we can enhance, or we will inform you about, that you can apply in your practice. But it's about really meeting the needs of each individual. And it's really interesting because there are so many different ways to look at different situations. And so being able to elicit that information from the individual, understanding how that person kind of thinks and how they behave and what influences their decision making is a really important part of the work that we do. So that brings us to, let me see. Let me stop right here. And let me just ask a quick question. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Did everyone get their iceberg handout? Up, down. No? Okay. So, but you know what? I can. Iceberg handout. Let's see. Okay, so I just dropped it in the chat box. You should have received it in your email. And so, but I'm going to bring the slide back up, and I'm going to ask you folks to comment. I'm going to run you through a couple of questions, and I would love to hear from you where you think some of this stuff, where it lands. So the iceberg, this has been around for a long time, ever since the beginning of the first versions of cultural competency trainings. And so the idea here is that what you see above the line are some of the more salient characteristics or observable traits of an individual. So this has to do with how an individual might dress, and their gender identity might have to do with physical characteristics. Are they big body, small body? Their eye behavior, and that really refers to do they look at you directly? Do they not look at you directly? In terms of how they communicate, we always pay attention to facial expressions and body language, and that's really key. Now that's above the line, the line of the waterline, and that's really just speaking to what's observable, and that's what's available to us. And yet what we don't always think about is what's lying underneath. And this is what we encourage, what cultural competence actually starts to encourage you to do, is for us to be able to look at what's underneath, what any facial expressions, what might be behind how somebody behaves and what somebody says. So really understanding how these other factors influence what we do see. And so the sense of self, the religious spirituality, how a person identifies their gender, emotional response patterns. And we're always kind of watching for cues to understand. And I know Dr. Blackwell will cover some of the trauma-informed information, but we also want to understand how sometimes someone's behavior may be indicative of some underlying issues. And so, and depending on the capacity we serve in, because social workers, addiction counselors, we all have different approaches and different roles and responsibilities. Some of us have to address immediate issues, and some of us can actually explore deep down to find out, to learn about some motivating or causatory factors. And so here underneath what we do see, it also includes the approaches to problem solving, how a person thinks, what is it that influences them, what is their decision-making process, what does someone perceive to be perceptions of mental health and health illness. Would that be important, particularly with some populations or some communities that are less likely to be open to even accessing a mental health screening because it's not necessarily talked about and there's stigma in that community. The perspective of value between an individual versus the values or the belief systems of a group. Is that influencing some of what we do see? The patterns of, and this is interesting, so patterns of superior and subordinate roles in relation to status, age, gender, class, and orientation. So what's the question? So the question is, what is it that you notice? What do you notice, and where do you think that these 4 options on the right-hand side on the top, what you see on top of the water, behind the eye, on the right side of the iceberg, you see disability, age, race, ethnicity, sexual identity. Where do you think those would fall? Where do they fit in this iceberg, in this list of factors in the iceberg?
I think it depends on the disability. Some disabilities are very visible and some disabilities are not as visible.
Very good. So thank you. So you're bringing up a point about, okay, so what we see and sometimes what we don't see. Thank you so much. Jerron?
I think it's very difficult because there are some, that maybe you could look at and be able to see, but then you could also make a bad observation, because even look at age, it's sometimes difficult to get someone's age. So you might look and say, yes, that's a elderly person, but then, as they come younger, it may be a blur. So it depends, and I think it would be bad to make that judgment, because it could cause complication. It can make things worse. So, you have to be very careful, even with sexual identity. You could get it wrong and make things worse.
Thank you. And that's really at the core part of this iceberg. Thank you so much. I also see Yvette.
Yeah, I've recognized some of these on the top of the iceberg to be with mental health, because a lot of them, when they come in, we've been co-occurring disorders now. We've been integrating both mental health and substance abuse together, and I noticed that a lot of mental health patients are not, they don't look at you in your eyes. They have body language where they're closed up. They don't want to, they're really not there. They're in their own world. They're maybe not medicated, or they may be over medicated or stimulated by outside medications. So I've noticed that in them. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
thank you. Yeah.
you know,
So,
we have
and
a
I
question
appreciate
here
that you
that,
talked about the integrated care too.
yeah.
So thanks, Yvette. If someone else had their hand up. That's okay. All right, so here's what I want to ask. So what I see in the chat box, okay, there it
I
goes.
see two
And
people.
Melinda, go ahead. And Melinda?
Okay, I just had to unmute.
Okay.
It's also with, for instance, with disability, it's not always obvious. For instance, if someone's not doing eye contact or has a nervous laugh, or it has could just be that they're neurodivergent, that they're autistic, and that's not a disability that people come like that they know they think autistic means just nonverbal, and there's an entire spectrum. So it's you could be sound mental health, but just that this is a challenge and getting people to see who you are, at least in my
Yeah,
experience.
thank you, and Melinda. Appreciate that.
Is it okay if I interject for a second?
Sure, of course.
One of the things that we always need to remember is that while we are striving for cultural humility and cultural competence, and we're looking at this iceberg exercise, one of the things that always clicks to me is that the same way that we're thinking about how we may be perceiving clients, et cetera, is the same way that some of those things impact how clients perceive us. And so just remembering that when we're talking about the alliance and connecting to folks, that there's a reciprocity that's happening. And so thinking about when a client comes into the room and sees you, what do they see and how do they respond to what they see, what they perceive? Just kind of wanted to add that in.
Thank you, Doris. Nicole, so I see you put your headphones on. Do you think maybe you can unmute and see if we can hear you now? Could you type it in the chat box, please? Thank you. So I don't want to dismiss it. I really want to include it. I see you, Yvette. I'm getting there. I just want to make sure that we all heard what Dr. Blackwell was just talking about, that, the different perspectives, not a linear approach, is different perspectives come to play in every interaction and every setting. So the way we perceive folks is also likely the same dynamics that may be occurring with the client community with us, which certainly would impact their responsiveness to our support and how we engage them. Go ahead, Yvette.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of respond a little bit or just, share some stories. When I say that I'm diverse, right? I say that because my whole family is different cultures, right? We have when they married another culture or whatever. So I had to learn how to identify and make them comfortable as well as me feel comfortable. I've identified autism at different spectrums in my own family. Some of them have overcome those challenges without any care, and some of them need the care. It's between identifying it within my own family and then learning about it in the real world with my job and seeing the different personalities. There's a lot of things that have not been diagnosed on some of the people we are taking care of. They come into the office, they've never seen a mental health doctor, or maybe even a medical doctor. They have fears, they haven't had the appropriate medical coverage, whatever that. So there's a lot of stuff that comes, it's a big ball of, like a lot of rubber bands all mixed up together, and we got to take one rubber band off at a time to kind of get into the core of this person and hopefully be able to service them with some, positive affirmation and positive support, and put in place some of the things that they may need, and hopefully, if it's possible, to guide them into those things, because a lot of them haven't even had those opportunities. It's sad.
Yeah, I think you're really you're also speaking to the point of the reason why another real reason why where we need to be tailored in our approaches, meeting somebody where they're at, you know, not where they, what they didn't have, but where are they right now? What do they know right now? How do they understand things? How do we connect with that? And still identify the strengths that we can reframe to help support them in their process. You know, so there's so many opportunities that we, you know, if we stray away from a linear way of perceiving situations and individuals, we will see those opportunities and those strengths in individuals. Did you type it in, Nicole? Oh, there you go. Sometimes people have to understand their own disability and what support they actually need because their support team may not be aware they might be treated differently. You know, yeah, so understand their own disability. So it sounds like you're speaking to empowering individuals, empowering themselves. And we have the opportunity to support them in that way as well. That's true. I think very often we don't give a lot of credit to what supports and information education that we give and opportunities we access for individuals where they can take a lot of those same strategies to help self-advocate, you know, into other areas of their life and with other community resources. So thank you for that. The whole thing about what's above the line, what I want to suggest to everyone is it's not just that what we see is motivated or influenced by a lot of things that we don't see. And that's definitely putting in layman's terms. And age, disability, race, ethnicity, sexual identity can apply in all these different areas to different degrees, to different levels, at different points, and maybe highlighted more at some certain times more than others. But I want you to consider this. Even what you see above the line is subjective, because what we see or what we perceive is actually influenced by our own values and belief systems and our own expertise, our own experience, our own values. And so even that is subjective. So even though what we think we see, we may not necessarily be accurate. And so that really speaks to potentially making assumptions and really taking a step back from doing that. Even if in our line of work, where we tend to see certain behaviors more commonly than if we worked in another field, in another discipline, or in another situation, even that is questionable. Even though we have a lot of experience, it doesn't mean we don't know what we're speaking to. It means that we don't know for sure. So we as professionals need to admit that we do not know our clients and start from not knowing to learning to understand to helping. This is exactly right. Even with what is observable, let's not even the research kind of gives us patterns, but we know that human beings are not static. And the same, just to build on a point from before, is the same way we think about what is influencing someone's way of living, someone's way of making decisions, what are the factors that are mitigating. Sometimes we think of it as risk and protective factors. Those things apply to us as well. And we bring that to the table for when we interact with any given individual. So as we go along, let's keep some of that in mind. So self-awareness, being unaware of one's own cultural framework, creates the potential for both personal conflict and interpersonal misunderstanding in multicultural environments. And this is foundational to how cultural humility is defined. And we will get to that. And so here, cultural competence training, it happens on two levels. On an individual level, it increases awareness. What we are hoping to do here is not just increase awareness, because awareness just leaves you there, understanding and realizing that there are differences in people. But as providers, we want to be taking a step further and be more strategic in how we are aligned with the different members of the communities that we provide services to. It's not just to be aware, but what do we do afterwards? There should be an action part. How do we use strategies to help tailor our approaches to support the needs, the specific needs of a given individual? So the other level is also the organizational level, where it examines systemic issues. And here's the thing, everyone here is tasked with working within an equitable systems that exist to help meet tailored the approaches to meet the needs of given individuals. And so cultural competency training happens on two levels, but it starts to identify and helps to if we go, and the way we're going to go into this, it's going to also help identify strategies to help work more effectively. So the training alone, and Dr. Blackwell had covered this earlier, training alone does not change organizational cultures. It takes a lot more than that. it's a nice idea that anybody can have at any one time, an organization can have at any one time, but without follow through, without the action to commit to the action, or commit to an ultimate goal for the agency where almost everyone can play a part, then change does not happen. And there's two ways that people and organizations lose out. The communities don't get necessarily the services that can meet their needs specifically, and organizations themselves don't stay in. And I'm going to use a financial perspective, is organizations don't stay in a position to be competitive if they're not being effective with the communities. And so your track record is also going to be prefaced within the grant applications that you submit. So cultural humility and cultural competence terms in definition. And so some of the things that can help us, and just foundational concepts so we can build upon as we go through the training. We're going to go through some of these. So it is interesting. Let's make it more clear. And so what is cultural competence? And so does everyone define cultural competence the same? I want you to take a look at this cartoon grid here and look at these 6 different individuals and the different comments that they're making. So it really refers to different perspectives on a particular subject matter, and saying this is what I think. It's got a few good points. I don't agree. Seems logical. I think they're all wrong. We need more data. And so it's a gridlock among the severely educated. Cultural competence has certain general definitions, but it's not necessarily specifically agreed by everyone who uses it. And so sometimes it's important to understand context. And so cultural competence itself, there's a few definitions that kind of come under that umbrella. That's what we're going to go over now. And so I'm going to play this video. Actually, it's an interactive way of understanding some of the definitions. And so give me a second, because this goes to a website. So here we go. So what is cultural competence? Actually, you folks tell me, what is cultural competence? How do you define cultural competence? Before I even go through these slides.
Hey, this is Lindsay with our team. And for me, I think it's like the bare minimum. For me, cultural competence is the very basics that you would need to know as a professional working with others. I think that cultural humility, or some of the other terms that were listed in that umbrella, are more encompassing of continually learning. Okay, thank you. Great. It's also people having different opinions and views according to Nicole. Jacqueline, I don't agree with the term competence. There's been a lot of arm wrestling in terms of definitions. So that's understandable. Having the openness to learn about others and apply that knowledge through the services you provide, understanding your own views versus the views of others, and being willing to learn. These are really, really good comments. Awareness that we're all different at our core. We need and want the same things as human beings. Okay, let's see. Okay, these are really, really good, having a good depth of understanding of our and other cultural norms. All of those are components of cultural competence. I'm going to go through these definitions, and we will speak to it more as we move along. And I think some of this does align with what you folks are mentioning here in your chat. So let me go here. So cultural competence. Right now, this is the term, this is the definition that we're borrowing. So a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies and structures and practices that come together in a system or an organization or amongst a group of professionals that enables that system, organization, or professional group to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. And that's a mouthful, and that came back from Cross and colleagues back in '89. And these folks were, this article, some of these first articles were the ones who that guided the work by the National Cultural Competence Center coming out of Georgetown. And so, but even we have evolved, and they have evolved even more from this. But this seems to be the most comprehensive and yet the most conducive definition of cultural competence. But there's so much more to unpack. So let's go through a few more definitions. that will probably speak to everything that you're commenting in the chat. So cultural competence is often used very interchangeably or aligned with these other concepts we're going through. So cultural humility, which is part of what we're talking here. Cultural competence for me, and I'm just saying for me, tends to speak to the ability to be able to be effective with different individuals, different situations, and cross-cultural situations. And that right there kind of speaks to being able to maintain that capacity to be effective with individuals within situations and such. It really refers to an ongoing process. You know, if you don't practice, you lose. So it's really about how you maintain a level of effectiveness. So, and when we're talking about diverse communities or communities in general, we're talking about tailored approaches. And so cultural humility is also a concept that in practice can be the process that can lead to culturally responsive services. So cultural humility involves the understanding of and respect for cultural differences, which refers to the relationship between two perspectives. So the idea here is to actually have an other person oriented approach. And so we as providers can meet with someone new and be more focused on what we can learn from the other individual so we can better support them. And so that other person or other oriented perspective is in relation to the aspects of that individual's cultural identity. And so, because what is most important to that person, how they perceive their situation, how things work in their life, and the realities of their world, you know, it's what's going to help us be more supportive and effective in working to meet their needs. And so cultural awareness, it's a general term. It's used to indicate that a person is conscious of similarities and differences between and among cultures. It's just not where we want to stay at. Cultural awareness is really a stepping stone into action. Cultural responsiveness is actually the end goal. When we think about equity, when we think about equitable services and tailored and meeting the needs of individuals, you know, we're thinking about how we can be culturally responsive. And that's really has to do with the process where we are respectful of people of their culture as well as as those from other cultures. Being responsive means I am, and I think of respectful as being more, not being rude to someone, but actually learning what is specific that individual, their belief systems, and how they live, and the things that and their strengths and what's important to them, as well, and integrating some of that into how we support that individual. And so that responsiveness in practice, that responsiveness as an organization is essentially where we want to end up at, because that's when we're speaking, that's what aligns with equity. Also, cultural sensitivity, we spoke to that. It's an awareness of the nuances of different cultures, and also our own culture. The thing about us being aware of our own culture is that awareness is also something that we can go a little deeper into and consider how our own values and belief systems actually influence how we perceive, what we perceive, how we interpret, what we do or don't do with some individuals or some situations. And so that's important. So I think cultural sensitivity is not just for the communities that we provide services to, but also understand how we are. And so it's the individual accepts cultural differences, but in a non-judgmental way. You know, there's no hierarchy between the cultures. Culturally appropriate is sensitivity to the differences among ethnic, racial, and linguistic groups, and awareness of how people's background, belief systems, you know, how they respond to services. So culturally appropriate, it really aligns with cultural responsivity. Generally used to describe interventions and practices. And a lot of times it is from a logistical perspective. But it's definitely, but it can also be used, you know, in terms of provider interactions. So culturally relevant is, you know, is a certain skill that in cross-cultural and multicultural settings empowers individuals intellectually, socially, emotionally, and politically to use culturally reference to impart knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So linguistic competence, and one of the things I mentioned was in the culturally and linguistically appropriate services standards for services. Out of OMH, we do speak about linguistic competence. That is part of being culturally appropriate. If you cannot, part of our ethical responsibility is not just to convey information, but to do it with transparency and with clarity. And so most of us have programs where we're mandated to ask someone's preferred language. And so it's not, and then it's not just the language. Communication involves language and also comprehension. So looking at those dynamics and how that can play out. So providing, information where it's readily available for those with limited English proficiency, as also by folks who may be maybe visually impaired, and making sure the understanding who your community are, and those are the dynamics that are involved, and you want to make sure that what you have, like literature, is available, qualified translators, language assistance services, different types of literature that kind of reflects the communities that you're serving, making sure that we're meeting their needs and being able to fulfill our ethical responsibility, and not just transparency, but the clarity of information, be able to meet those individuals' needs. And so health literacy, which we'll talk to more specifically when we come back, is really about the capacity for the individual to obtain, process, and understand basic health information. And you folks were given structural competency has to do with social determinants of health. I'm going to speak to that more specifically when we meet on Wednesday. So I'm going to kind of bypass this, so lend me that patience for a little while. The health literacy, you have a video that we'll speak to when we come back. Transformation is a journey, not a destination. I went through this pretty quickly because I kind of just don't want to beat you over the head with it. The reality is these definitions are going to play out in the content that we will continue to discuss. And everything that you bring within the chat, I love working off the chat, within the chat, and those, because if you don't want to voice it and you're comfortable typing it, that's fine. Your voice will still be included, and that's great. We love that. What I do want to continue to encourage you is that your voices and your experience make this training that much more robust and that much more applicable. So thank you for everything that you're sharing. I had to reconnect my iPad. That's fine. That's fine. I'll tell you what, we are at 10:49. How about Eastern time? How about we take a 10-minute break, come back at 11 a.m. Clyde will put on the timer, and we will continue from there. Let's take a breather and kind of just debrief the information so far. Okay? All right. You can turn off your camera, but don't log off. See you in a minute. Okay, so so hopefully everyone took a minute to kind of debrief, take the opportunities to kind of, maybe that oops moment. And you're probably going to appreciate that you have these opportunities often throughout this curriculum to debrief a little bit. The more you debrief, the better you can internalize what we're trying to convey here. And so, all right. Welcome back, Sharina. See, that spirit, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I want to see here. So let me ask you folks, we've already gone through the definitions, some of the foundational concepts, and we'll go through a little bit more before I turn it over to Dr. Blackwell. So what I'm going to ask you folks is, anything that stands out, anything that's kind of coming out at you, because you're being very participatory, very responsive. I appreciate that. Anything that kind of stands out so far for you? Once, going twice. So, okay.
And I don't see anything in the chat.
No, I don't see that either. Okay, so I'm going to go to a few more concepts to define a little bit more, because now we're going to broaden our understanding of these concepts and start to consider, and for us, it's the opportunity to start to consider the application, not just in our individual practice, but in our environment. So culture has different components, but they're dynamics. They're constantly fluctuating, moving. If you think about the cultural wheel, it has here the community, the greater community, the community that people live in or they're a part of, stories and knowledge, language, traditional rituals that so many may grow up with, technical skills, tools, objects, food, drink, the arts, values. So culture can be considered from different perspectives and may land in different dimensions or layers for different groups, and more specifically for different individuals. That's the culture part. Now we're unpacking the other side of that term, the competence. And it says here, what you know, what you think you know. Well, I also want to suggest that competence has to do with ability. And so it's not just what you know. What you know tends to be more static. But how do we add to what we know? How do we continuously do that? Because if, as far as I know, cultural competence is not really speaking to proficiency with any one given individual or any one given organization. Can you realistically know everything about everyone at any given time? And because and because communities consistently changing the challenges, the stressors, and all different factors that influence just the daily life of any given community or person, so it really encourages us to think about a process. It thinks about an ability to be effective in cross-cultural situations. And it's impossible. It's great to know certain things about certain patterns, to be aware of patterns within communities, but that's not static information to use with any one given individual. So I say, nope, with defining what cultural competence, the notion that there is discrepancy as to the definition of competence and skill, the need to identify ourselves and then understand others. So walking in others' shoes. Thank you for that. We only know what is outwardly visible and others want us to know. And even that, I'm going to suggest that that is also subjective, because what is outwardly visible, it's up to our interpretation. So how do we see certain things? Because my colleague might see completely different according to their expertise and their perception. And so when someone says something that is contrary to one belief to be true, we can say more to encourage them to expand. Now you say, thank you, Jacqueline. Now you start to speak about a process for listening. Thank you. Hi, John. Please unmute.
Hi, how's it going?
How you doing?
Good. So one thing I was thinking about was one time I was meeting with a Japanese client, and she was like looking me in the eyes the whole time, and I had learned that the Japanese is a show of respect. They don't look you in the eyes, and so I brought that up with her, saying, I had learned, tell me if I'm wrong. You seem to be not having a problem looking at me in the eyes or anything. I appreciate it, but I thought it was different. And first she thought, and she said, I don't remember. Then it came to her like a light over. She says, oh, my grandmother does that. And so to speak to like changes and different people within a culture and changes over time within a culture, and I guess acculturation that may occur with somebody of a certain culture. So I was just thinking about all of that. I was like, oh, my grandmother did that.
Yeah. So thank you, John, for bringing that up. I appreciate that example. So let's build on that. So for everyone else, so let's talk about the eyes. Use when we think about contrasting values, think about the eyes. When someone looks at you, when someone's looking you straight in the eye, you're interacting with them, you're trying to provide services. So John was just speaking to how culturally that's appropriate, particularly for the older generation of the Japanese community. So, but John also mentioned other factors that can actually influence that, whether generations and other dynamics. So thinking about that, because I don't think we don't know any human being to be static unless you're a robot. And if they are, we're not providing them services. So when we're talking about human beings here and thinking about the eye, what is that further speaking to? In terms of some communities might look you in the eye, some communities may not. What might come up for you with that? I have a certain idea in my head. I don't want to tell you. I'm hoping that you can tell me. Okay, yeah, respect. I like that. Humility. That's definitely the direction we're going in. I want to see if we can elaborate just a little bit more.
Someone also put in the chat stereotyping.
Yes, I see that stereotyping. I see shy. I see something to hide. Interesting. Introverted. Okay. Clients, irrespective of culture, may not give eye contact. They may have certain diagnoses. Very good. And also the DSM is mental health. There's some conditions that might, influence whether someone can even look at you in the eye. Neurodivergent. Thank you for that. So all of that, honesty. Let's see. let's see, what if, let me just put something out there and you tell me how you feel about this. What if what we're talking about here is really speaking to, like, we can't make assumptions? Because what can be a reason for one person can be a different reason for another person, but we don't know reasons, we don't know motives. We see a behavior and then we interpret it according to our lens. And so what may be behind that? So I'm going to give you a practical example. So when I had to facilitate some client groups in some of my past career moves, if I had a young person, a young adult who was more gang related and is used to a certain ritualistic way of being, when they go to court, they might have to look somebody else in the eye because they've been conditioned to understanding that looking someone in the eye is a way to hold their own, to stand their ground. It's also a way for someone else, for another person or another individual, not to think that they can just take advantage of them. And so it was almost defined, but it wasn't so much defined as it was them standing their ground, because looking away can be perceived as a weak thing, and they can be a victim of someone's assault. And then, in terms of being gang related, I'm thinking of a particular client that I had one time, and that was part of his dynamics in how he looked at people and didn't look certain people in the eye. It was more about security for self. So we can't make assumptions we don't know unless we ask. And so the humility piece is really important here when we think about culture humility and the process. And I'll speak to that a little more specifically. So yeah, so we can't always think we know, even though we're in the business of seeing certain behaviors more commonly than most other people in any other profession. You still kind of really have to question just to be sure. Yeah, the introspective side, the awareness with ourselves and others and what our abilities, limitations, understanding. So this is what I'm thinking about. Well, both sides, what we think we see might be is subjective, and what is going on from the other individual or the communities or families, there may be influencing factors that we don't see. Going back to the iceberg, but also going to the notion that not making assumptions is key here. Okay, I see some of the comments. I'm going to go back to the slides because I'm on a time crunch. So to be culturally competent in every situation, it means that you would have to do certain things to sustain that level of confidence. And so you don't just arrive, you just don't know everything about everyone and everything stays the same. That couldn't be further from the truth with the communities, with human beings. When you're in the people serving business, that does not fall. That does not fall true. So what do we do to sustain our ability to be effective in cross-cultural situations? So some of the dynamics here when it comes to organizations may be about, and we spoke about acceptance and respecting differences. Self-assessment is a key part here. Knowing yourself is a fascinating thing that happens when you're more aware of your own belief system, your own values, and you're consciously aware of that. You have a better opportunity to not allow it to be part of the lens you use to interpret behaviors and understand other individuals. And so the self-assessment is key, both from an individual provider perspective and an organization. This is also important, and that's part of cultural humility components. It's also about wanting to look inside. What's going on? What makes us who we are? How do we perceive the world? What influences our interactions, what influences what we see. And so organizations can do the same thing in terms of looking at the policies and procedures, how they conduct business. Is it culturally appropriate? Is it culturally informed even from that perspective? So the attention to the dynamics of difference, continuous expansion of cultural knowledge and resources, and adaptations to service models. The other thing also is in terms of cultural responsivity or equitable outcomes, or those improved outcomes that we are speaking to here, we will specifically speak to here, is cultural competence does lead to better communication. And it's really not being the dominant individual in a particular interaction, in any kind of interaction with individuals we're providing services to, but to enhance communication, it takes a partnership. And so also, how do we improve medication adherence through our ability to culturally support the individual? How to improve their health status, how to help them improve their health status. It also speaks to fewer emergency visits and hospitalization. It also speaks to fewer dropouts. You know, it's not, sometimes we're not retaining people in care, and so this can have an impact. It's the integration of this knowledge and behaviors and attitudes, also from an organizational perspective and policies, procedures, you know, and it's not like, think of it like this. It's not important, not just important that the person who is providing direct services to the client community be culturally competent, but it's also important that the board of directors, the human resources personnel, the administrative staff, the executive leadership, that everyone actually benefits from regular cultural competency trainings. So the mindset uses culture as part of the lens as opposed to an add-on process. We want to start to enhance an environment that is conducive, culturally conducive for the client community, particularly in terms of diversity, but also for the staff that provides the services. So the ability to systems to provide care to patients with diverse values and beliefs, and we've talked about that many times already. It allows individuals to increase their understanding and appreciation of cultural differences. So one of the things that we may not always be aware of, and so I don't like to make assumptions, so you won't hear me make absolute statements, but what I notice is that sometimes if we are intentional about it, we can actually start to learn about any given individual and from their cultural perspective, and understand that some of those can be elicited and used as strengths within a reframe of the support system, using those value systems that the individual has to help support them in their wellness process. So how do we factor in a culture of poverty? That's going to be part of the conversation when we start to speak to social determinants of health, because the environment, a very toxic and stressful environment, if you will, is also part of what influences, you know, how an individual deals with certain situations. It's also a way how we can start to understand how that might segue, might be foundational to why some folks end up with, get caught up with substance use and maybe exacerbated mental illnesses. So we will incorporate that. So what it comes down to is cultural competence is, it says here, is a development process that evolves over an extended period of time. We can even add a little bit to that and say it is a process that continues to evolve if we continue to inform it, if we continue to add to it. If the humility part of culture is that we don't know everything, we don't want to make assumptions, but we want to continuously feed our information and effective ways to engage community members so we can continue to be more culturally informed and culturally competent with them. So I think this may be familiar with some of you folks. And you don't have to respond to this question here, but sometimes for ourselves, because this is not for supervisors, this is not for colleagues, this is for ourselves. When you look at this cultural competence continuum, we know that cultural destructiveness is one end of the spectrum. Cultural proficiency is the ultimate goal. So cultural destructiveness, when we think of examples such as, what do you think as the examples of? What comes to mind when we think of cultural destructiveness? I'm pretty sure that, and I don't like to make absolute statements, but I'm pretty sure everyone could come up with at least one example. Could you put that in the chat box? Censoring books, bigotry, racism, there you go. There you go. Yeah. And think of historical, historical initiatives that and have consistently existed. Microaggressions, racism, yeah, prejudice, yes, sure. So cultural destructiveness is behavior that really seeks to change and even annihilate. So think about what during the colonization days when actually oppressed Europeans ended up coming to this country, and then what ended up happening was during the colonization process, the indigenous people were almost annihilated. They were changed, their rights taken away from them, their country, their land taken away from them. So cultural destructiveness almost started to feel like this is what you want to destroy. When you think about the Holocaust, during the Hitler era, and trying to annihilate, trying to kill off the population, talking about cultural destructiveness there. And so these are like really quick examples how we've seen it historically. Cultural incapacity is another way of thinking about cultural capacity is a way of considering how we don't see differences, how services may be just very linear in how they roll out and how they're provided, and that it does not take into account that there are cultural differences within the communities that those services are being provided to. So the incapacity is really on the part of the organization and the provider, where they are not being tailored and accepting and incorporating the differences within different community members and how their services are received. And cultural blindness, how anybody wants to put that in, you can be, it's really thinking about when we perceive ourselves as unbiased. I'm not going to go into it deeply because I'm going to let, that's a piece that Dolores is going to do in a little while. And so when we perceive ourselves as unbiased or ignorant of cultural differences, it's like, it really speaks to, like, we don't see as culture as being a factor that should warrant tailored outcomes, that we don't see it being a big deal, that is not necessarily an important part of how we deliver services. Yeah, a lot of institutions are stagnant and don't consider the changing times of social events that impact communities. And that's unfortunate. And those are the folks that may not necessarily see huge numbers or in terms of a lack of retention with the client community and such, and that's unfortunate, because just from a business perspective, just to be competitive, you want to be able to have broad scope and broad opportunities and strategies to be able to provide services according to that community or individual. Ageism, okay, oppression, cultural capacity, out of sight, out of mind. Okay. So cultural pre-competence, let me go there. A movement towards cultural sensitivity, which is great. Being able to at least be sensitive, it says a few things. It says that we are aware there are distinctions, that those distinctions do influence how people behave, what they do, how they think. And at least we are aware, but aware of it, and I'm always pushing this, that awareness is not enough. It's a great place to start. Then what do we do further? How can we be more supportive to the communities? Well, there's a pre-competence level of culture. And so that's when we do attempt to integrate some information into our service delivery, and to understanding that differences do exist, that these differences, but that these differences are acknowledged, but not necessarily that too much of the services are really tweaked to meet the needs. Very specifically, sometimes it seems like it's an organization might present or state that they're culturally informed in their practices, but they're not necessarily effective with diverse communities. Cultural competence, which is where we want to go to, is the capacity to function in an effective manner. And so being effective in cross-cultural situations, being able to be aware of differences, being able to elicit information that help us to be better allies and better support of someone's health process or behavioral health process. And so it's the idea that we integrate. Cultural competence is a slightly older term. I tend to use cultural responsiveness more often, because cultural competence is really speaking to an ability, but really the idea here is a process that helps us be more culturally informed in tailoring services and meeting the needs of the client community. And so cultural proficiency is the most positive end of the spectrum. It is ultimately a place where it may not be as realistic for any individual provider to be. I remember we had a brand where we were going across the country and working with the problem-solving courts. And one of the ideas that I think seemed to land well, and you folks can tell me, is that the more culturally competent an individual professional is, that collectively, the more culturally proficient the organization can be. Because cultural proficiency speaks to being able to be like a very high level of effectiveness of understand and being proactive with cultural differences, integrating that in practices, being able to evolve even from the cultural relationships, understanding that those dynamics change over time, Our communities that community demographics don't change every 3 to 5 years anymore. That stopped a long time ago. Every year, an annual assessment can help you understand what are the nuances or the new things that are coming up with the communities in your catchment area. So cultural proficiency looks to incorporate all these strategies that we started to speak to and will speak to more specifically. Okay. And so linguistic competence is really speaking about what are the language assisted services that we have available. You know, it's nice when a provider can speak the language of a particular community member, but it's a little bit more than that. It's about having those assistance services for those folks who whose language we don't know. We don't want anybody to walk out the door without us being able to help them in some kind of way. And language should not be a barrier. And the barrier is not just for the person looking for services. The barrier is for us to be effective, and that's part of our goal. Is to meet service, to have services meet the needs of those individuals. Just because we don't know the language, that's why we have language assisted services. Do we know what they look like? Do we know when's the last time we've been trained on them? Do we have interpreters readily available? And how does that work with all the regulations that we have to follow? Cultural identity, I went to speak to that, shaped by being part of several cultural groups that are important to one's life. And we're going to speak to it in the cultural identity wheel coming up now. And so, for instance, there are defining features of different groups. And so some of it is like for the professional Black woman, the conservative religious Muslim, the immigrant from Mexico who only speaks Spanish, the stay-at-home suburban gay father. These are just some examples. I would say there are so many more. Let's talk about, first of all, any comments, any questions to what's been covered so far? Okay, these are really good comments that you've been adding, so thank you for that. That's making this really much more robust. That's what we want. So no, not yet. Okay, so I got one for you, Sharina. So this is what I'm going to ask you. So you all received the identity wheel, okay? So hopefully you all responded to the identity wheel questions and you sent it over to our colleague Tree. She's collecting all that. That's all part of how you're going to end up getting 15 hours accredited for this course. I'm going to go back to the identity wheel on my PowerPoint. So here in the identity wheel, what we see as, different components of identity, different layers, different dimensions. And so there are some questions here. So we were supposed to check off what identity we think about most often. We wanted to put an X where an identity you do not think much about. And so I want to speak to those two first. And so how did you feel, and this really would take some interactions with you folks. We will, Eunice. So how did you respond? What did you see when you started to check off and put crosses in different parts of the identity wheel? Was it just static? Joshua.
So I realized that when I did my identity wheel, the attribute that I look at the least is sexual orientation.
Okay.
When I say I look at it the least, I don't ignore it, but I lead with my pronouns first, and then I leave you at that. I leave it at your humanness. I don't care about your sexual orientation. I care about what you want to be called and keep it moving. The one I focus on the most, which I'm slightly ashamed of, is race and ethnicity. Only because we tend to be safer in spaces where you can identify with the people in those spaces. And so I tend to look for the groups of people who look like we may have a commonality before I look for anything else. We can figure out the rest of it later, but if you look like me and look like we can have something in common, that makes it easier to start the rest of the conversation.
So may I suggest can I say something to that? Thank you so much for sharing. So are you actually Joshua? Because I know there's a few people coming out with that name.
Yes, I'm actually Joshua, yes.
Okay, Joshua. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to just ask you a little further, because you say I'm ashamed to say it, but it's like, I don't think that's anything to be ashamed of, but it's like we do look to our comfortability because we often know that when we come outside of our group, sometimes we put ourselves at risk for certain things.
Yes, ma'am.
Can that be part of the thinking?
Yes, it is completely part of the thinking. So I'm an Army vet, And so I look
Okay.
at different components of people that look like me or look like something that I have in common. So if you have a U.S. Army vet hat on, I'm more likely to come to you before I go to somebody else, because we
Okay.
have a commonality that will supersede the harm I could possibly have in this space.
Totally understandable. Totally get that too. Great. Thank you so much, Joshua, for being so
you.
candid with us. Oscar, hi. So
Hi,
what identity did
the
you most often, and what identities did you not think about so much?
yeah, the one that I thought about the most were the majority. I thought about race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, gender, sexual orientation, age, national origin. Those I thought of the most. And thinking about them the most does not mean to me that I was worried or bothered by any of them, but it just meant that these were factors that would continuously present themselves in my life in one form or the other, whether it was me dealing with myself or me dealing with others. Now, the one that I thought the least about, that one was more me and myself, and that's the socioeconomic class. Because I sort of always feel, and again, this is just me, that that sort of takes care of itself if you're working on it. Meaning, are you working with a healthy budget in your personal life? Are you working towards academic performance that will lead to a degree and better employment? That I feel that I think least of, because I think that if you sort of put the working tools into that, it will sort of take care of itself. So that's not something that I contemplate too much of, even though, again, that's just on me. And the other ones, I sort of generalized it into areas that either I'm intrigued by. For example, I've always been fascinated by religion and spiritual development, comparative religions, anthropology, the different religious systems that exist worldwide and how people connect with them. What is a higher power in one culture? What is a higher power in another culture?
Yeah.
So I sort of generalized it a bit. And
Okay.
on that and the ones that I'm interested in. And then I personalized it more in the one that I least think about.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. Before I go to Melinda, let me just read what Nino just put. Thank you, Oscar. That was really insightful. Thank you for that. And Melinda,
For me, the thing I think about a lot is socioeconomic class, because I deal with a lot of poverty and immigrants in the city, and so it's just like the health disparities that being poor cause, not being able to have transportation, not being able to afford medicine, to have to choose between getting the medicine you need and getting a meal that's something that I think just stays in the forefront sometimes, especially when, like, for some diabetics, insulin is $400. That's a lot. So, and I have two type 1 diabetic kids, so it adds up. And the identity I don't think about much is age, because I look at it as you can't change it. It's gonna keep coming no matter what. I will be blessed enough to turn 60 this year. So I consider it a blessing. So it's like, I still feel like, I can run around and do stuff. So it's really in your mind, I think, when it comes to age, as long as you have some Advil for the aches and pains every now and then.
it's interesting how there is some, for some of us, there are certain associations with certain parts of our identity. Yeah, and when you mentioned the age part, it's really like, what's the thinking that we tend to have when we get to a certain age. So thank you for bringing that up. Tatiana.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to highlight, so one of my identities is being Latina, and Josh's comment just made me think of just like the iceberg, how oftentimes, like, I may be perceived as white passing, but I have the Latina in me that like has my norms, my cultural beliefs, and just how that implements like my daily work that I do with my clients and just how I perceive my daily tasks and duties.
Mm-hmm. Tatiana, forgive me. Could
Yes.
you repeat again what you said when you said white pathing, I think you said?
Yes, just because like I'm fair skinned and have like very relaxed hair. So some might perceive me as being white but I just have like that. It just made me think of like the iceberg, how oftentimes like we don't see certain identities from a person
Right.
unless we like dig deep into like communicating with them and just speaking on like their stories and stuff.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So part of the reason why I asked you to repeat that part is because when we think about the client communities also and what you were saying and how what you might pass as is not just your identity, how you identify, but you spoke to how you are being perceived. It's interesting because it just triggered a past experience with one of my clients where we were trying to get resources for him, and what he showed me his application for some of the community resources. It was like his third application, and he was changing certain factors. Like he was not identifying as the black Hispanic person that he had always identified. He started to put down on paper that he was white because he was trying to be resourceful in terms of how to access certain resources that weren't being readily available. So it's interesting how that factor, the perception, can impact an individual, how it can be used how some folks have been resourceful in trying to access resources for themselves that way. And that's kind of like what triggered. And so now we're seeing so many different trajectories and layers of identity and benefits and lack of benefits. So thank you. Thank you for sharing what you did. And I wanted to ask folks now a little bit more about also, did you do this identity wheel and see more than just what's on the identity wheel, other components, other layers? Is there a part of your identity that you'd like to learn more about? Is there an attribute of your identity that has the strongest effect on how you see yourself as a person? That's true. Yeah, that's pretty much what I said, Thurston. Thank you. I think about abilities in social classes. Yeah, we always think about race and ethnicity and gender, and you know what? Yeah, classes and how does society put people in classes. And so, sexual orientation, being a trans woman. Yeah, so the different impacts and different layers and dimensions of identity. So first, we can think about how it speaks to us as individuals, and we can also start to consider how our clients, how it speaks to them, but also how they're being perceived, how that can influence whether or not they're able to access resources, if there are resources and such. Vivian, go ahead.
The identity I think about the most, I'd say race. Because as soon as I exit the home, I'm in a constant state of hypervigilance based merely on my skin color. And then there's the code switching that comes in right after that, but that's a whole different training. And the least, I chose gender because in today's society, the woman is seen as inferior. And I try not to focus on that because I walk in my individual strength. And that's pretty much those responses. I could go deeper, but I won't. And that's for this afternoon. And your last question was the strongest effect on how I see myself. I'd say resiliency, personal resiliency.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
That's 3 questions, right? Okay.
No, those are all the questions, and I appreciate that you highlighted your resilience. I so appreciate that. And thank you for your comments. Thank you for everyone who participated and added their comments and how they identify in the wheel. This whole thing about the wheel is to help us kind of just reflect on who we are. The more we can reflect on what makes us who we are, how we identify, how we see ourselves, the more we can translate that in terms of strategies where we can, excuse me, see and understand who our client community are. So it starts and begins with us. And so when we think about our personal identity, you know, what makes us us, and how we were raised, and maybe some of the traditions and values that we still adhere to, because it doesn't always stay the same in the context of a larger culture, perhaps a dominant culture. We have different levels of acculturation. So certain things we might adhere to certain degrees, some things we may not. So personal cultural identity is part of the dynamics that help us understand who we are, how we see ourselves. Sometimes it's the community, society itself that can't help but help us understand our identity, because sometimes because the society itself, with systems, with situations, with protocols and policy, legislation even, helps remind us who we are and what we are able to do, what we are not, maybe not readily able to do. And so sometimes we're highlighted in that way. We can't help see ourselves a certain, identify a certain way. But I love the fact that at the end, Vivian, you added the resiliency factors, because there's so much strength in whatever identity that you provide, you use for yourself. So cultural identity is part of what we bring to the table. You know, even in our professional capacity, we're still bringing who we are as a person. And so what we've always learned. And so the part of that is also thinking about how we've been conditioned to behaving, how we see the world, how we live. And it can certainly influence our lens and how we see and interpret someone else and their behavior. And then in our professional capacity, our professional cultural identity is how we define ourselves. So that has to do with, are we the therapist? Are we the addiction counselor? Are we the social worker? Are we the peer recovery support specialist? You know, and our roles and responsibilities and what we tend to engage in more commonly. And that was all part of our professional cultural identity. And the thing is, we bring both. We bring both and more, because the environment itself also has certain influences on us. And so cultural integration really has to do with how we define our professional identity, how our cultural identity is melded in there as well when we show up and present to provide services. And so it has to do with our values and beliefs, has to do with the community we work in, the community we're from, the community we work in. That environment has to do with certain behaviors that are more common within our discipline, within our professions, within our the roles and responsibilities. It has a lot to do with how we communicate with other individuals. You folks who are in the people helping field tend to have a really wonderful way of engaging the community. You tend to like to help the community, and that's what that part of you that motivates you to get into this work and stay in this work to help other individuals. I like helping individuals. That's also part of your identity, which we don't always capture here. All of that comes in together, you know, and speaking to how you interact and how effectively you can be at any given time with other folks. This is part of who you are. And what I want to suggest is that who we are and understanding all these different dimensions and all these different, maybe even experiences and education and expertise that we have, along with everything else that's been mentioned and more, is part of who we are. Although there are certain parts of our identity that will be more prevalent or more highlighted for us within ourselves more than others. But we bring so much to the table. With all those different fluctuating, different dynamics that does not necessarily look the same on any given day as the next day, we also want to consider how this translates with the different people that we provide services to. And so thinking about that, we know that some folks have been assimilated into the dominant culture. That's when an individual or community, an individual goes into an environment that is not with their that doesn't have the same values and belief system that they grew up with or they identify with, and they actually adhere to those values and not adhere to their own values anymore. And that's really the foundation of assimilation. It can be forced. It can be part of a reaction to discrimination or prejudice for many immigrants. It could be a choice. And for a lot of folks, can be a choice. What tends to happen more often is acculturation. And we see that more often, where people come into the country or different families have migrated into communities has a lot to do with you leaving one community and still still maintaining your identity and also adhering to the dominant culture ways of doing things. And so it's doing both. And so we see research that has the highest stress levels in these communities that tend to acculturate more than we do in in individuals or communities who tend to just work mostly with their cultural traditions. And so it's I see Melinda. 1 second. I said so it's bidirectional. It's a process incorporating these cultural attributes, but it's bidirectional, so it affects both the host and target individuals. Considers the psychological processes of culture contact between two or more cultural groups. And so really was that it's speaking to, it's very highly stressful for individuals who are holding on and adhering to their own cultural values and their own traditional norms and still trying to learning and adhering to the values of the dominant culture. That's a high stress and opportunities for individuals. And Melinda, what were you going to add?
I wanted to say that, for example, when they say for pressures culturally assimilating, it is very hard when you're neurodivergent and you have to go to a conference that has 4,200 people. It is an overwhelming amount of information. As a data analyst, I thrive. That's where I center around a lot of strange faces and people. It is a coping where you have to learn to be able to take a moment to back away. But it is expected when you do a job to assimilate, and being in a conference with 4,200 people is expected, rather than have them understand that it is truly a pressure that it takes all that you have. And I think that it's not just assimilation of culture, but also assimilation of behavior that we have to take into consideration sometimes.
Yeah. And for those folks who assimilate, it's interesting, those folks who assimilate and don't practice their own culture, whatever cultural relevant or cultural traditions that they grew up with, tend to have a less rates of stress than the folks who are cultural. Assimilating is like leaving behind everything that you knew and just going into and adhering to everything that you're learning now. And that's a tough thing to do. And it sounds like that was very overwhelming to be amongst so many different sources of information and so many different trajectories. And that's not the easiest thing to do, especially, and then you say you're a data analyst, so I hear you. So I wanted to say that these are different things that different communities and community members have gone through. And so these are other impacts of their processes that also affects and influences their identities, what they do, how they think, how decisions they make, whether they have access to resources and such. Being able to be open. The humility part is really about understanding that we don't know everything. We don't know everything about everyone all the time at any given point. So how do we learn? Even if we're in a profession where we tend to see the common behavior and the common challenges, but we see different people with maybe similar situations, but they're different people. And so it encourages us to kind of take a look back, and think about how the dynamics may be different and not to make assumptions. So lifelong learning really speaks to being able to elicit information to understand. We might even have hunches and we might be very good at what we do, but we don't go by assumptions, we actually go by listening information. That really speaks to also the other component, which is engaging in self-reflection. When we engage in self-reflection, it's like looking within ourselves, understanding what our own value systems are, particularly in the context of the work that we do with individuals who may be very different from us. And so being able to reflect our own value system and our own biases and our own ways of addressing situations, all of that, just bringing that awareness up has a fascinating way of giving us an opportunity not to let that be part of the lens that we use to meet and work with other people. So it's okay to be comfortable with not knowing. There's some folks that I've met over time that thought that culture humility had a way of making them seem as if they didn't know what they were doing, as if they weren't competent professionals. Be comfortable with not knowing. Not knowing says a lot about the fact that you're not making assumptions about anybody and you're looking to elicit information and working with what you get from them. The nice thing is that we don't have to confuse it with our expertise. It's when we elicit the information is that we can understand how we can use our expertise in our strategies to be more tailored and more effective with that individual. So it doesn't have to do with our own competence as a professional. It has to do with how we use our skills appropriately for that individual. So be comfortable with not knowing. So that way, that also can prompt you to ask questions. And there's also the power and privilege dynamics that tend to happen when someone comes up to seeking services, and then they're going to us, and we're the person of authority. We're the ones that can access all to these resources. We're the ones that can provide them that Metro card. We're the ones that can help them keep that those certain get the access to the different resources that are going to help maintain that their economic, their financial stress, help bridge that gap so they don't get dispossessed. We're the ones that can help supplement, opportunities for them so they can have, childcare and so on and so on. And so we tend to be viewed up here a lot of times when the client comes in here. We don't do that. We don't do that. We want to balance out those dynamics. We want to partner with our clients and our patients. We want to walk with them as an ally through their process, through their wellness process. And that's the whole idea about that. So those different components speak to culture humility. And that's essentially more of a process that can help us lead to being more culturally competent and culturally responsive in services. And so I want to play one more slide because I've already taken on a lot of time and I have to give it to my colleague. And so I'm going to show you this one video.
Every day, we make decisions that affect our health in workplaces, grocery stores, doctor's offices, and at the kitchen table. Yet, nearly 9 out of 10 adults lack the skills needed to fully manage their health care. Health literacy refers to the ability to obtain, understand, and assess health information in order to make appropriate health decisions. It means being able to interpret nutrition labels, understand dosing instructions on medications, and ask informed questions during routine doctor's visits. Low health literacy occurs when there is a gap between the knowledge of a patient and how health information is presented. The ramifications of limited health literacy are higher rates of chronic conditions, increased ER visits and admissions, and higher medical costs. A person's level of health literacy is impacted by their belief systems and culture, age, level of education, and communication style. Older adults, non-native speakers, and people living at or below the poverty level are particularly vulnerable. But anyone, even highly educated adults, can face challenges when it comes to health literacy. Given the complexity of the healthcare system, it's not surprising that low health literacy is linked with poor health outcomes. A recent review of research suggested that low health literacy resulted in a 41% increase in mortality and a 12% increase in hospitalizations among patients with heart failure. Health literacy is fundamental to the success of every patient-provider interaction, every prescription, every diagnosis, and every treatment. Therefore, improving health literacy is critical to reducing health disparities.
So I'm not going to process that, but I am going to leave you with one concept here. When you think about health literacy, these are the aspects that the video speaks to. These are aspects of care that would help individuals elicit, more tailored services to have their needs met. What I want to suggest is for us to think about our ethical responsibility to ensure that if they don't have it, how we can inform them, how we can empower them to learn more, to understand different strategies, how to be able to self-advocate, and how it's our responsibility to help them understand what they can, what their rights and are within any particular different service available. And so things like that, especially like, for instance, like when I had clients when they didn't know that they were entitled to an interpreter, in the emergency room, and they didn't know until I told them. And I said, no, you weren't entitled to that. They didn't know for that. No, they would say, well, you're entitled to that at no cost to you. I said, that's just a federal mandate. That's just how that's a issue that is given, and no, not all community members know that. So something like that. So health literacy is really our responsibility to help inform and empower our clients so they can self-advocate. They won't be with us forever, but we want to help empower them so they can support their own wellness process. And so with that, so I'm not going to have any comments for that or anything, but although I appreciate it, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague.
Hi. So I think we are at 11:55 right now, and you received a lot of information about continued leaning into cultural competency, cultural humility, etc., health literacy, which is incredibly important. And I think we can take a break right now because we're getting ready to move into a topic area, implicit bias. And so it stands like it's a good thing for us to take a woosah moment and to prepare yourself for that conversation and what that will look like. And so I will see you in 10 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. We're actually going to get started. Let me see. Let me just do a quick fly through. Okay, so before we get started or restarted, I'd like to do a temperature check-in to see how folks are doing right now, how folks are feeling about the material that we've covered thus far, or that was covered thus far, how folks are feeling about the things that they're thinking about, processing, etc. Because I'm seeing a lot of interesting and great comments in the chat and wanted to create space for that, to just take a moment and just kind of process what you've heard so far. So I see great information. Thank you. And you can feel free to unmute yourself to also share as well. Great info, definitely. Self-reflecting, just another, it's just another to absorb all at once. I have heard some great comments. Huge topic and never-ending learning. Absolutely. Interesting perspectives, challenging, feeling good. Appreciate all of the comments. Absolutely, because there are some amazing comments happening in the chat where you can see the self-reflection. You can see folks thinking about the material. And again, kind of thinking about, and I see folks saying a lot of aha moments. Absolutely. And that's my favorite phrase, aha, that light bulb going off. And checking on your layer of competence, absolutely, when dealing with other cultures, there's a lot happening. This is to be expected with this particular webinar, with this particular training, that there are going to be aha moments. There are going to be moments where folks are reflective, folks are thinking about the information. When we finish today, there'll be things that you'll still be processing, of course. It's a lot to process, but ultimately, it is something that helps you along your journey. Now, I want to piggyback on something that Diana mentioned earlier. Oh, and someone said it's always amazing to always learn something new in these classes. Great information. Awesome. Thank you. So I wanted to piggyback on something that Diana mentioned a little earlier, the identity wheel, right? The identity wheel. And kind of thinking about the different aspects of who you are, what you choose to have front facing, the things that you choose to acknowledge as important, or the most important aspects of your identity, and the things that may not be as important, but they are a part of who you are. I want to introduce and kind of lean into this concept of intersectionality. And what it leans into is that we represent different aspects of ourselves, right? So when we think about all of the things on the iceberg, when we think about all of the things on the identity wheel, it's thinking about the concept of intersectionality, the different aspects of who we are as individuals, okay? And the things that change, wherever we find ourselves, how they impact how they think, how we feel, etc. all of that is kind of connected to our next topic, which leans into the premise of implicit bias. We are a creation of our experiences as young folk, our experience is our work experience, our experiences as different parts of our identity, right? And so how we kind of shape our world is framed from those experiences. How we make sense of the world is framed from those experiences. And when we lean into all of that, there's a lot of different things that we need to lean into in regards to how we see people, how we, connect with people, etc. And so I want to just kind of tie that into where we're going right now, which is called implicit bias. And we're going to lean into that a bit. I also want to remind folks of our ouch opportunities, that during this conversation or during this portion of the conversation, if folks feel like they need to take a moment, if they are activated in some way, that is okay to step away. It's okay to say, you know what, I am activated by this. And if you feel comfortable in sharing what's activating you, that's fine as well. But I just wanted to kind of remind folks of that, because when we get into some of these challenging areas, such as implicit bias, it may lead to some activation points, okay? So I'm going to share my screen. Hold on 1 second. See if I can get myself sorted out here. So we are now leaning into the area, or we're going to lean into the concept of implicit bias. Just by a thumbs up, how many folks have leaned into implicit bias in other spaces and places, trainings, etc.? How many folks have leaned into this concept? Okay, I'm seeing quite a few thumbs up. Okay, let me just check the chat. Yep, I'm seeing quite a few thumbs up. So some of this material may be a reminder for folk. Some of it may lean into stuff that they may have already begun to think about and process, etc. So I just wanted to kind of get a sense of where people were landing with it. Yes, yes. What do you mean by leaning into? Leaning into means looking at it, touching it, going into it, really challenging yourself around it. Okay? All right. Perfect. So, implicit bias. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to lean into is there are a number of tools that we can look at in regards to implicit bias, right? And kind of leaning into that process or beginning to unpack implicit bias, okay? And one of them is called the Harvard Implicit Association Test. And the link is located on the slide deck, and it's something that you can access. And it's really leaning into particular areas around developing or getting a sense of what your potential implicit bias may be related to. And so when you get an opportunity, please, take an opportunity to look at this particular association test. And there are other tests and other measurements out there to kind of help you unpack and lean into potential implicit bias that you may have. And remember that this implicit bias is something that we all have, okay? And it comes from our past experiences, etc. Okay, so just wanted to be clear about that. And so I wanted to lean into the premise or talk about the premise on your preferences, right? Because that's where, when we talk about implicit bias and we talk about who we are as individuals, how we came to develop our experiences, etc., we develop a sense of preferences. So I'm wondering for folks, when you think about this quote by Angela Davis, right? You think about this quote from Angela Davis. Okay, we have to talk about liberating minds as well as liberating society. Okay, how might your preferences be showing up? How might your preferences be showing up? And folks can feel free to unmute themselves. Joshua, please share. Would you like?
So I'm gonna preface my answer by saying I've cheated. I've taken this course with Judge Mosley recently. I've taken my test recently. I'm realizing that my preferences, either good or bad, in my eyes, often has a biased lens to it based upon where I've been, who I've been around, but also the knowledge I carry into the space. And so I have to, if you don't check your bias, you can cause harm to people that you are here to serve. And you sometimes come off as that savior complex, thinking I know what's best, versus allowing you to do the work that you need to do without me judging you through that process.
Excellent points. Excellent. Other folks? So some folks said some folks have actually taken the test, which is great. So I'm going to look at some of the info in the chat. Great tests. I've taken several. Personally, I find myself finding people similar to my own personal identity. I'm gay, Asian woman, and so I tend to steer towards people who identify to those same communities. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I might not understand what language a person is speaking, and guess what they need instead of asking. Wow, very powerful, very powerful. Okay, putting my implicit bias spin on what is being said. Excellent, excellent. Other folk, please feel free. Okay. So some folks may be typing in the chat, kind of leaning into what are some of the ways that our preferences can show up. Classism. I think Joshua, you mentioned something similar to that, like classism, elitism, white supremacy. All of those things are things that might be showing up when we are working with clients, right? How our preferences might show up. Okay. Behavior may reveal preferences. Preferences may be inherently biased. Interesting. Okay. Interesting. I wanted to ask Thurston, you mentioned that preferences may be inherently biased. Would you feel comfortable in sharing? And you may need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so anytime you have a preference, you always set up the bias by having the preference. It's never without. Just to prefer something is bias, and just in general. If I prefer something over something else, that the bias is inherent in my preference. So what makes me comfortable doesn't always make someone else comfortable, but my preferences make me comfortable. And they suit my values and my principles, and they allow me to live inside a life that I feel more comfortable with because I'm inside of my preferences. So they're inherently biased.
Excellent. Thank you. And then I also see what a person has been taught or learned, absolutely, and that's connecting back to the material that we leaned into the identity wheel, and all of the different aspects of who we are inform our preferences, okay? Inform how we present to the world, how we see the world, etc. Other folks? Someone said agreed, behavior is communication. Okay, excellent. Other folk? Okay, hold on one second. My bias shaped by past aggressions can make me defensive. Absolutely.
Can I share something?
Absolutely can, because I was about to open it up, and you can share, because this is one of those questions where you have to take a moment and really lean into it. And so definitely please share.
I'm gonna lean into some honesty, because I work with DHS, and I'm working in a women's shelter. And although, I work with the ladies, I utilize the open-ended questions and I deal with them in the now, like where they're at. But what I do here is CASAC assessment. I do the CERBERT, the assessments for substance use. And I'm really learning to deal with them when they first come in, because after I do the assessment, I don't actually see them unless they need some assistance, But it's like when they were getting their vouchers and they moved them out pretty quick in here, I was feeling a little envious because they get some nice apartments, and then the rent is not
as much, the rent is not, they don't have to pay that much. And then I'm thinking about the rent that I have to pay. I was just feeling a little envy at time because I'm like, maybe I should go through the system, but I really don't need it the way that they need it. But I was just feeling a little jealous because the payment and what they have to pay is not as expensive once they leave here. But it's about being able, and one of the ladies talked about it earlier, was like the resiliency, being able to bounce back. And, I'm just here. I'm happy to be here and be able to hear their story and help them to get through.
Thank you for sharing that, because
You're
it shows
welcome.
up in a variety of ways and a variety of spaces and places. And part of implicit bias, or a big part of it, is our own self-reflection and self-awareness of when it happens, when it's being activated. Thank you. Would anyone else like to share? Just making sure I'm checking the chat.
Yeah, just very quickly,
Sure.
your senses activate your preferences. They really do. What you see, what you taste, what you feel, what you hear, a person's voice, the way they look at you, the way they respond to you, the way you perceive that. I mean, your preferences don't always have to be set from the past or from your culture. They could be set in the moment,
Mm-hmm.
where your response to what you see ignites your preferences. And then you live inside of that as you react to the person. I know quite often just attraction to someone is setting a preference.
Mm-hmm.
And you could be attracted to a patient and not attracted as in romantically, but what you see, they seem like they understand. They seem like they're listening. They seem like and then when a person stops that, you respond to the person as if you respond to a person who stopped listening to you, instead of taking in the fact that this person has the right to stop listening. This person has the right to check out on you. And you take it personally that they checked out or they stopped listening, and now you feel a kind of way. And it really reflects on your preference that people have to listen to you. And so you get caught up in now making a person manage your feelings as opposed to you acknowledging their feelings.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great. Great. And thank you for sharing that, because that's powerful. I mean, when we lean into the whole premise of implicit bias, we're keeping ourselves in check and we're understanding what our preferences are, where they're coming from, how they might be showing up, how they might be recreated over time, reshaped, etc. But really kind of keeping ourselves in check is a great statement and reflecting that. So, implicit bias has a biological component, and our brains register over 40 million bits of sensory information per second, and most of it's processed subconsciously or preconsciously, right? And so this leans into the premise that the way we respond to people, the way we respond to situations, etc., is connected also to brain science, right? So the conscious brain can only process 800 bits of sensory input per second. And so that's 2/100th of 1% of what the subconscious can process in that same time. And so 95% of what we think in relationship to our brain activity is subconscious, and about 5 of it is conscious, right? So most of how we're responding is subconscious, and only 5% of it, we're conscious of it. Okay. So when we talk about the whole premise of implicit bias, okay, it's also known as unconscious bias. And it's the unconscious attribution of particular qualities to a member of a certain social group, right? So we have judgment or behavior that operates at a level below our consciousness awareness and without our intentional control. So this is not about our intention, it's about what happens unconsciously. Okay, and it impacts our day-to-day interactions, and it can actually lead to us making instantaneous decisions about folk, experiences, people, etc. And it's based upon our personal experiences, cultural environment, biology, and as someone indicated a little earlier, things as they are changing, growing, etc. Our senses can also trigger this as well. Our unconscious mind relies on instinct, and we make snapshot judgments about our surroundings and people we meet without even realizing it, right? Without even realizing it. So it's something that we need to lean into on an ongoing basis, that unconscious work that we need to do, or the unconscious attribution that we're making towards people based upon a variety of different personal experiences, etc. So here's the thing. All of us in this space have implicit bias. None of us is immune from it. We all have it, right? And it doesn't make us a bad person, okay? So I just wanted to kind of lean into that premise, because when we hear the word bias, that activates certain thoughts about what that means. And admitting or kind of leaning in or reflecting on our own bias actually means or activates things for folks as well. So what does learning about our unconscious or implicit bias tells us? It tells us that it's natural and largely unavoidable, okay? It's unavoidable because it's something that we all do. And one of the things that's very interesting about all of this is that we are predisposed to be biased against people who are unlike us, okay? And we tend to show more favor towards people who are like us, and it's who are like us, all right? And so it's not all about being negative, and it's not necessarily intentional, because we know that unconscious bias is unintentional, something that triggers or automatically happens. And so people will often not have insight to their own bias, okay, until a situation happens. Then we suddenly realize that it's invoking a certain behavior from us that is driven by our bias, right? So situations where people are under emotional or cognitive load are more likely to evoke behavior driven by bias. And unconscious bias impacts our behavior in subtle and unintentional ways. Subtle and unintentional ways, okay? Someone mentioned, Aaron, you mentioned bias is experience. Absolutely, absolutely. So I wanted to acknowledge that that was there. So implicit bias, what is it? Okay, often we are unaware of our own bias and the bias of others. There are some things that we may, once they've been activated at some point, recognize that this is something that I'm feeling right now. This is something that I wasn't even aware that was actually there, and it's been activated in some way. So the thing is that we all have bias, right? We all have bias. It doesn't make us bad people. And it's a part, kind of leaning into implicit bias is a part of ongoing self-assessment and growth process, both personally and professionally, right? And we know that implicit bias cannot be eliminated, but it can be managed successfully. Our own implicit bias, it can't be eliminated, but it can be managed. We can recognize when it has been activated and we can manage it, okay? So it's about close your eyes and open your mind. Close your eyes and open your mind. So keeping ourselves in check. How might our biases be showing up? Okay, so these are some of the potential examples. How might white supremacy be showing up in my thoughts and behavior? How might anti-Blackness be showing up in my thoughts and behavior? How might classism be showing up in my thoughts and behavior? How might elitism be showing up in my thoughts? And how might dissonance be showing up in thoughts and behavior? Okay, so I want to ask that question. I'm asking about very specific things and wondering where folks might be landing with that. I'll check the chat. And folks can feel free to unmute themselves. Okay. My tone of voice, body language, and not allow the client to speak. Okay. Tracy, is it okay if I ask if you wouldn't mind sharing? Yes. Okay.
Sometimes their bias can come out in a different way. Your body language, sometimes you cut the client off short based upon their culture, their value, their perception. From my angle, sometimes that can happen. I've seen that happen to prospective clients where someone who looks like them but different culture cut them off. And the body language is cold and indifference. And I'm like, how can you do that? They're here to get services. So you have to be mindful of that. like folding your arms when they're talking to you, making facial features, or being dismissive towards them. So you really have to be careful with that, really do. I've learned working with New York State and I work with licensed psychologists is you have to listen and you have to acknowledge them and say, am I saying this correctly? This is what I'm hearing from what you're sharing with me. Key words, share, understand, how can I better service you? I'm limited in this area, but how have I referred you to someone who knows this better than I do? Because people go through a lot. So that's how your bias sometimes comes out.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. Having the space to say, I don't know, am I connecting with you in the appropriate way? Am I hearing you correctly, etc.? Being okay with saying I don't know versus making an assumption. Okay. Also, what you mentioned a little when you first began to speak about tone of voice, body language, etc. The way we present to folks in regards to body language happens almost instantaneously, and we may not even be aware of it. We may find ourselves folding our arms, etc., and it's happening, and we don't. And if we were to stop to think about it, we don't even know why we folded our arms. And so that's the unconscious component of implicit bias really kind of potentially coming up. Okay. So while there are some examples that we have here, like white supremacy, anti-Blackness, classism, etc., really leaning into what our preferences are is a part of really leaning into the whole premise of the ongoing journey around cultural humility and cultural competency, recognizing our preferences when they come up, when they show up, and how to manage them so that they don't impact our work with clients. Okay. So I am going to ask another challenging question. And again, these are challenging questions, and it's okay that folks may need to sit and process it, but that's a part of this learning experience, right? So share an experience of when your implicit bias got in the way of you interacting with people or making a decision. And let's take a mindful moment and just take a moment and process it. And if anyone would like to share, definitely feel comfortable to either unmute yourself or share in the chat.
I will chime in. There have been times where, because of my experiences, I have assumed a comment was, well, probably misinterpreted a comment, or believed that I was receiving information based on experiences when it was based on something different. For example, I've been in spaces before where I've been perceived as being angry, or my emotions were not being interpreted correctly. So if I'm in a similar setting and I hear someone start to respond in a manner that seems that they're thinking that I am angry, or my emotions are just not being perceived correctly, I might change my tone, or just explain things in a different way. Whereas they may be responding in a manner that, maybe they share the same feelings, or maybe it's just that their reactions maybe are, they're showing their emotions, or the things that they're thinking in a similar way. So I'm misreading their emotions. It just gets really complicated.
It can be complicated, and thank you for sharing that, because it can be, because we're connecting to people, we're interpreting, or I'd say connection to people, and we're connecting based upon what we think is happening. right? How they potentially may be communicating with us, etc. But that in turn may be our thinking and may not be what they're thinking. Or it might be similar, we don't know. And so leaning into that and figuring out, okay, in this interaction with someone, in this interaction, am I clear about where I'm coming from and where the person is coming from? And taking the time to unpack it and see, okay? And kind of not, and give people space to do that, because the other part of that is that sometimes we, add emotion to the mix, and somehow it all gets confused in this stew that we're not really clear what just happened. Okay. Oscar, you had your hand raised?
This is Thurston, if I could ask a question.
Sure, no worries.
All right, so my question is, when I am dealing with a patient around their sexuality, and I have this question of what is the authentic self when they say that, or the authentic truth, what does that truly mean? I'll give you an example. So I was in a training, and there was the question, and so the question was, this woman, she had been married, 20 years, 15 years, and she had children, and so forth and so on, and her marriage went bad, and so through that marriage, she identified herself as being a lesbian, and the people who were running the training said she had found her authentic self. And I was like, okay, so then the 20 years of marriage and children and being a wife was not authentic. And so I'm trying to understand, when people share this concept of authentic self, were you not authentic being whatever you were before you realized what you wanted to be? Or is authenticity, or my authentic truth, is it what I say it is and not what happened? I don't know what authentic truth means, and I don't know what authentic, I don't understand it. So that's my challenge. I don't understand it. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult one. And when I say challenging and difficult one, because authentic truth is authentic for the person who's presenting it, right? It's the person who's presenting it. And our authenticity and living our truth can change over time. Sorry. So that can change over time. So, because we as individuals change over time. Okay. So authenticity, thank you for that, Teresa. Authenticity, I'm having one of those moments. It can be dynamic. It's not static. It doesn't stay one way and that's it. Okay. So their authentic self can change, and it doesn't disavow anything that's happened in the past, right? It's just where they are at this particular time. Okay. So someone mentioned that not everything is in black and white. Absolutely. And it changes. Okay. So Thurston, I hope that was helpful to you.
Hi, this is Oscar. My shared experience of the implicit bias would be whenever I observe an other possibly using stereotype in making a decision. That would be the implicit bias. For example, if you see a white person and they may start to comment on their academic background and work experience, and if it is of a high level, one may quickly start to feel that this is an entitled person, or I may start to feel internally implicit bias that that person is internally entitled, and they feel entitled, and that therefore they may have some white supremacy within them. And that may be a stereotype. They may simply just be enumerating their credentials based on whatever topic of conversation has occurred, and it may not be at all white supremacy implied within, but it could be. So that would be implies bias any which way I go with it. Likewise, if I see a Black person or a Latino person, and I may say through an implicit bias that they have limited education. And then as they start to elaborate on their background, they have a graduate degree and tremendous work experience in different professions. And so all of those are eye openers to myself. When I find myself, even briefly or momentarily, getting like hit by some kind of stereotype, it's a matter of downgrading yourself almost like we talked about humility and allowing that humility within yourself to kick in when you start with the stereotyping. So that's sort of like my bit on the implicit bias and experience and how that can interact with decision thoughts that one may have.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing. I definitely wanted to get to Joshua. You had your hand raised.
Yes, ma'am. Just a quick story. So for implicit bias, I don't think this really ran home to me until I started my doula practice. So I'm one of the only Black male doulas in our state. I'm the only Black male doula in our state, but one of a few Black male doulas nationwide. And I was working at the time with women as a birth doula and having to realize that I was the perpetuation of their trauma in the space. And in that moment, it helped me really understand not just implicit bias, but also why trauma-informed care is a thing. Because I look like the man who may have gotten you in this situation. I look like the father who may have talked down to you. I look like a form of other things. And I had to understand their implicit bias towards me as a Black man in the space, right? It made it easier for me to then adopt. I operate in these spaces as a male doula and so now my practice is centered on men and not women because I don't want to create trauma in the birthing space. So just that small implicit bias from the other side of understanding how we show up for the people we serve and how they may have the bias towards us. And we have to be okay with diminishing ourselves so that they can be comfortable where they are.
That is a great example. I think all of the examples have been great, and that's a powerful example. And we're going to lean into trauma-informed tomorrow, not tomorrow, I keep saying tomorrow, but Wednesday, because it's all connected. And I just think that your example was just amazing in regards to you being in that space and coming to the realization that folks are responding to you based upon what you represent. And that may be their implicit bias, but it's also informed by their trauma as well. Okay. Thank you for that. I just want to make sure. I think there was one more person who had their hand raised. I think it was Yvette.
Yes, I put it down because I'm hearing what I wanted to say in the other persons in the group. I just wanted, sometimes I'm the biased person with my feelings, and sometimes it's the other person towards me. And, like I've been able to recognize that. Thanks for this class, because I have a situation with one of my grandchildren, and she's in the hospital, and I'm thinking that one of the nurses gave me, like, she was talking to me in a certain way. And I looked at her and I said, this Latina, I'm Latina. Why is she talking to me this way? Like, who does she think she is? Do I need to make her aware that I'm not dumb, that I know what I'm saying? And then I said, I'm going based on my feelings and my emotions. Right? I have to step away. And I did, because I said, she's doing her job. I'm trying to do her job for her, because this is my family you're talking about. And I had to leave the room for a minute and vent, say what I needed to say with another person. And then I went back in, and I found her to be very nice, because she was just doing her job. Sometimes we look at biases as something could be cultural, could be sexual, could be a whole lot of things, but it could just be the moment of somebody just having had a situation, right? An emotional or behavioral situation with another human being, and they bring it with them. Either it could be them and it could be me. And being able to, identify that and say, don't react to that right now. Sit down with yourself for a moment, figure this out, and then go back with a different perspective and a different, like a personality switch, right? Like I have to personality switch myself to deal with certain people in society, in other, areas where I'm not at work, I'm at somebody else's job. So now it's, it's vice versa. Yeah.
Another great example. Thank you. And that's connecting to implicit bias is happening on both ends of that relationship. The way we interact with folks and how we perceive folks and how they may be communicating with us, etc., and a variety of other things we may be unconsciously responding to, and vice versa. Okay. And taking a moment to take a breath to say, what's happening here? What am I bringing to the table? What are they potentially bringing to the table is a part of this whole process of really leaning in and figuring out what's truly happening. Okay. And it's not something that you're going to do one time and that's going to be the end of it. It's something that's going to happen time and time again. And so that's why this is called a challenging journey. It's not, okay, I'm going to take a test and identify all of my implicit bias and nothing else is going to come up. There are going to be things that come up. And so really acknowledging them, reflecting on them, and figuring out how to manage them successfully is going to be key. Someone else had their hand raised? And Melinda? I'm sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly. I apologize.
I also think that with bias, like in this situation I just made, you sometimes become the bias against yourself. Like if I'm in a room and I have the figures and the statistics, but I think, okay, these, and they're white, so I'm the only Black woman in the room, then I think, well, maybe my figures are wrong. My bias in the sense of they go, can you check that again? Like I have to prove myself, but at the same time, then I get aggressive of, oh, you just don't believe I know my stuff. So you bring that bias of the self-doubt and you're questioning because you question, but it's not even that, it's just a question. Are you sure? But that particular day, it set off. That particular day, it was like, that was the day I needed to hear, are you sure about that figure, the statistic? It's like, I know my stuff, even if I am the only Afro-Latina in the room, So it's like the bias affects me as myself and self-doubt, but it also affects the other because I am assuming that you're being antagonistic instead or trying to put down knowledge while you're just maybe asking a question. Like I have to rearrange all that.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And it goes back to, I think, something we talked about a little earlier. We're responding to folks, they're responding to us, and really taking a moment to figure out what's happening here. And for ourselves, why are we responding this way? Okay, why are we responding this way? It's key. Again, that level of self-reflection, awareness is always ongoing. Okay. I'm going to move us ahead because we are fastly approaching our time and I want to make sure that we get into this material a little bit more. And thank you for the comments that are coming into the chat. Gut reactions, what makes things more complex is that we experience cognitive distortions such as mind reading. Absolutely. Absolutely. All key and very valid points. So I'm going to ask for folks to take a look at this particular slide. Different appearance and looks. Can someone, or if folks feel comfortable, share when they look at this, what do they see?
I see like the same person with different mini attires.
Okay.
That's what I see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yvette?
Yes, I see my perception acting up right now.
Mm.
Because the difference in their clothing has changed it on each individual. Like the young man with the bandana in his hair, in his head, you know, he's a thug. Then I look down towards the middle and I see him in a suit and I'm saying he's a professional, right? And then the next line, the guy with the hoodie, uh-oh, watch out for this guy because he may be up to no good. Then I see him in a suit and I'm like, oh, he's a banker, right? And the young lady in the last row, she looks kind of, because women kind of, their appearances, we change with the hats and the thing. And, you know, I don't think the facial may be an indicator also in the last row with the lady, because her face is the same, hasn't changed, just as the men. But in the men, I felt a way. With her, I'm like, okay, so she's casual, she's good, she's wearing a hat. One day she braided her hair, she wears a hanky, it's raining outside. I didn't see the bias kick in me like I did with the men.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Absolutely fabulous. Okay. Someone said looks can be perceiving of others, same. So perception and judgment are based upon outward appearances. Absolutely. Let me get to the folks who raised their hand also. Brandy.
A few things this picture made me kind of more mentally aware is how I see people and those biases that I have. And then on the other spectrum, you know, not always judging a book by its cover, because I see the same person in different forms, but it's the same person. It's exactly the same person. And so what it does for me is make me just kind of take a step back. If I were to see the person with the hoodie, can I not articulate that this may be the same person who also wears a suit? And so that's one thing that this picture makes me to, you know, kind of more mentally aware, not to have those biases or judgments against people, because people may do the same thing to me.
And I'm wondering if folks are making the connection between the immediate thoughts when you looked at the different pictures, the different outfits, right? How much of that was activating implicit bias, right? Just based upon someone's outward appearance, what they were wearing, and what was that bias connected to? Was it connected to classism, racism, etc.? All of it, okay? I saw that a couple of other people had their hands raised. I think it was, hold on one second. People think that thugs don't wear suits. Watch The Godfather. So someone put that in the chat, right? I didn't see the faces immediately. Wow. Okay. Okay. Aaron, would you like to share?
Yeah, as I first looked at it, the first thing that I was drawn to was the clothing. It took a minute for me to say, wait, those are the same three faces, right? I didn't see anything but the clothing right away.
Absolutely. A lot of stuff being activated for folks. Catherine?
Yeah, what I didn't realize at first is that some of them, like within a line, are wearing the same thing. They're just wearing it differently. So on like the top row, the windbreaker with the hood up versus the hood down. The next row, the guy with the shirt all the way to the right, it's buttoned, but the other one, you just throw on a baseball cap and unbutton it a little bit. And suddenly it's like, oh, it's such a, you know, such a different perception. And then with the woman, I agree that I noticed the differences less with her, but the way that her hair is pulled up with one suit and left down in the other, I think it's all meant to kind of elicit like a different reaction, but it could just be like the guy with the windbreaker. It could just be like, oh, he's a little chilly, or it was drizzling earlier and he doesn't want rain on his head. But just those tiny changes elicit a different reaction.
Absolutely. And that's the brain, and that's the experiences, that's everything clicking in unconsciously. Okay. I have time for one more. Let's see, John.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like what the other people said, I mean, some of them, I'm looking at the pictures and I'm not even seeing the same individual. I only came to that outcome after somebody mentions it's the same individual along each row because, yeah, the mind was just making it into, oh, these are people of different socioeconomic statuses and subgroups and all this versus it's the same different things. It's amazing how the mind works.
And it's how it all clicks in, how our implicit bias clicks in, and how and what that manifests itself as. Okay. So just a quick exercise to remind you that this is something that happens unconsciously. We then respond to people based upon our unconscious bias, right? And being able to recognize that that's what's happening and taking a breath and taking a moment to say, what am I really responding to here? Okay, what am I really responding to here? So when we think about implicit bias, right? When we think about implicit bias, there are some unfortunate effects that's connected to it. So one, we can lean into the whole premise of racism, an ideology that gives expression to myths about other racial and ethnic groups, okay, the ism. Stereotypes, which we can potentially attribute it to folks' overall impressions based upon the assumption that all members of a group possess similar attributes. And actually also prejudice, which is also another unfortunate effect, a negative feeling towards a group based upon a faulty generalization. Everyone of this particular group, this is how they respond, this is who they are, etc. These are all things that we need to be mindful of when our implicit bias is activated. And so I want to lean a little bit into some strategies that we can talk about in regards to when our implicit bias is activated. Recognize and becoming aware that we each have our own unconscious bias. And the last example of the picture of the two folks, or the three folks, speaks to that, right? Folks didn't see faces, or folks judged based upon their outfits or what they had on, their hair, etc. And there are so many other levels that we could lean into in regards to that. Use of the power of knowledge, right? Use of the power of knowledge, or logic, sorry about that. Kind of processing it and figuring out what's going on. Hitting the pause button and doing some self-reflection, okay? Create a common ground and strive to be fair when you recognize your own biases, okay? Being aware in terms of your motivation to change. What do folks think about these strategies? Do they think it's something that they can actually utilize that makes sense for them? Have they utilized any of them? Let me go to the chat. They can be helpful. Okay. Okay. And Melinda, please. Definitely feel free to open up your mic and respond. And I see people raising their hands. Tracy, I'll get to you in a second. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, in me, my personal case, I had to go and work with what is going to be a redneck area. And being a New Yorker, you have a bias to go to the middle of Kentucky to do work. And, so I had all these preconceived notions. And meanwhile, the host family for the job we were doing was the sweetest people. They took all of that away in that sense, at that for that individual group. I still walking into, different places, my biases are still there. And as I call it, you still get the stare, in certain places. But this individual family that was the host family while we were working, they treated us kindly. They were, they were not what you would specifically say redneck, though that they were in that area. Like it's a weird way to describe it. But it was hitting that pause button and doing some self-reflection and going, wait, I have to be open. These people are being very open and very kind. They're not judgmental. They're not treating me like the other. They had their own biases, but there was a conversation where, for instance, she asked for a fajitas recipe, and I had to explain I don't have that because I didn't grow up with that. So we shared from each other. At the same time, it's like we got into discussion because they own weapons and gun control, and how they felt that it was for hunting. It was something from their background, so we got to share, hitting the pause button and doing some reflection. You end up recognizing your own bias, but it also gives you more opening to become aware that everyone has some bias. But if you start to communicate, you can understand.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. And Tracy?
I'm sorry, thank you. No, I think with the biases, you have to constantly evolve. You have to constantly learn. It's evolution. You got to constantly learn, because when you're dealing with multiple people, multiple cultures, you can have some biases that can really affect you in a very negative way, as well as the client you're trying to work with. So my belief is you just have to constantly learn. Constantly explore and ask people questions when you don't know. Please don't go around thinking you know everything, because you work in the field. You constantly learn. I had a professor who told me something before I graduated. She said, if you think you know everything, then you have not grown. So I take that with me. And I was an undergrad when she told me this. So when I got in the field, it was like, okay, always be open to learn something new. You never know enough. Things have evolved. I mean, let's take the situation with marijuana, cannabis. 40 years ago, it affected the Black and Latino communities. Crack cocaine. But as soon as it hit another ethnicity, Oasis changed their name. They quickly changed their name. I didn't know until I went to their website. I'm like, wow, isn't that interesting? And when Governor Cuomo, at that time when he was in office, how this Black woman said, but 40 years ago when it hurt our neighborhood, no one cared. No one really cared. And if you ever go, I always tell people, get out the city and go upstate. Go past White Plains. Go to Albany. Go to Rockland. Go see those communities. They live no better than you, but they want you to believe it because they have homes. You'd be interesting. It's just, you have to put exposure. I think exposure is so important. But the more you expose yourself, the more you really begin to understand. But sometimes my theory is, if we become stuck in one environment and that's all we know, another professor said, and he was a counselor, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So you have to explore and you have to evolve, because the world itself has evolved.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you for that. In regards to the constant evolution, the constant curiosity of who people are is key in this work. Okay. We don't know everything. None of us do. And so leaning into the premise of it's okay for me to ask questions. Let me stop for a second. I don't know. Ask. Okay. And doing some self-reflection. I'm also seeing folks talking about creating a common ground. Also, hitting the pause button seems to connect for quite a few folks as well, and doing some self-reflection. We have quite a few people who actually just love the analysis of folks, that prior analysis that was in the chat. I just want to make sure I get to everybody. And I think there were one or two people who had their hand raised, so please feel free to unmute yourself. Someone put in the chat, continues to terrifies me when thinking about split decisions made by police based on their unconscious bias. bias. Absolutely. Very powerful example. Very powerful example. Okay. And this is all happening. It's happening to us. It's happening around us. It's happening in our interaction with clients, etc. And so leaning into figuring out how you can manage this successfully is key in our work with clients. Okay. All right. So some additional actions that we can take are avoid supporting or strengthening your unconscious biases. Okay, expose yourself to positive images and or stories, because remember, our experiences, the information we come in contact with, etc., can either strengthen or deconstruct an unconscious bias. So we need to expose ourselves to different folks, as Tracy indicated, right? Different folks, different environments, etc., as much as we can. Recognize and be particularly vigilant in situations where you have incomplete information. Now, there are going to be some times that we don't have all of the information, but taking the time to stop and get as much information as we possibly can before we begin to make decisions, okay? Before we begin to respond, etc., taking that pause. Recognize and be particularly vigilant in situations where your own biases are likely to be most active. This in itself requires us to have some self-reflection and really do that self-awareness and know what our potential biases are, okay? Some of them we do know, and so know when those are activated and know how it is shaping the interactions that we're having with someone is incredibly important. Also, periodically test yourself to identify the types and strengths of your unconscious biases. Okay, so these are additional actions that you can take. What are folks' responses to some of this? Because this is a particularly challenging area to lean into. Okay, it's about exposing your vulnerability, it's about recognizing your vulnerability, and it's about figuring out how you're going to manage something about yourself that happens on an unconscious level. Does anyone have any comments about any of this? Check the chat. Hold on one second. Someone said, I think that these actions can be helpful. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's all about the journey, folk. It's all about the journey. So some other additional actions you can take is know where you are in terms of your motivation to change and manage your biases, right? You can recognize your biases, right? You can know that they're there when they are activated, but what's your motivation to change them? What's your motivation to change them is also just as important. And someone's putting in the chat, simple to be honest with yourself and challenging, but certainly helpful. Absolutely, okay? So you can recognize your biases, recognize your preferences, but are you willing to change them as a part of this mix? And reminding yourself the need to be fair and objective at all times, okay? Sometimes taking that pause and thinking about, am I being fair? Am I being objective? Or am I being or responding to something that's been activated for me is key, okay? And recognizing that when individuals are majority or dominant group members working with minority or non-dominant group members, that the performance may be impacted by this intergroup anxiety. Okay? These are things that you might want to think about. Now, someone, Thurston, you mentioned, I'm looking at the chat. So I see, Vivian, you mentioned emotional intelligence is very important, but Thurston, you asked a question, and I wonder if you would mind unmuting yourself and asking that question to folks here in the virtual space.
Yeah, the question for me is, are all biases wrong?
What do folks think about that?
I wanted to add that I think that we have already said before that bias in many respects is also almost instinctual and natural for the average person. So it's more of a matter of degree and quality in terms of what that bias is. So and I'm putting it totally on me, is that I would never say that, or I will try not to say that all bias is wrong. I will, however, examine the quality of that bias that I may have. And also, stereotyping is extremely important in terms of bias. Are you stereotyping totally without knowing the person hardly at all? So that's where I'm at regarding whether bias is wrong. That's my opinion.
Okay. Brandy, thank you for that. Brandy?
I was just gonna add that I think I guess it would depend on the use of the bias. I do see that biases sometimes is a mean of protection. And that's just something that's a learned mechanism. But I do believe it depends on how the bias is used, and what is I guess what is the end result of your bias as to whether the wrongness of it or how it's used or how it's given off. But I do think that it's a means of protection in some form.
Excellent, thank you. And also what I'm seeing in the chat is that it can be a fight or flight response, okay, until the higher brain assesses it and the actual level of damage. Excellent. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Not only if it impacts a situation or a negative manner, there is a very fine line between being culturally aware and prejudice. Interesting, okay. I have two participants who raised their hand. I think that was Brandy and Catherine, but I think you both spoke, right?
I was just gonna add, like, I think it depends on like morally wrong or wrong as in we know they're not correct, because I agree with people saying it depends on how it impacts the situation. But at the same time, biases we know are kind of generalizations, just like stereotypes. So I think we have to be thinking in our head. I agree that we can use them as protection, but kind of self-reflecting and going, well, I know this can't be true of everyone, right? So I'm going to try and monitor the way that it impacts my actions and words towards other people. But I also have to kind of think about, in the moment or later on, is this a deeply held belief that I have? Is this just a bias? And what is the truth of the matter? Because we know that generalizations of groups are largely, unhelpful and usually not truthful in our interactions with individual people.
So this reflective work that people are doing in regards to that particular question that was asked by one of your peers is the ongoing reflection work that you may need to do for yourselves, right? So just continuing to think about it and remembering when we talked about the group rules this morning, that there may be unfinished business. And so being okay with there may be some unfinished business as it relates to implicit bias. So I'm going to add an additional component or additional layer onto this. So a question, how would you address a negative bias if it has been expressed by a loved one? So I'm going to go to the chat. So you're going to see that pop up. Oh, okay. Ask clarifying questions, ask questions and listen. Folks may also feel free to unmute themselves as well to respond. How would you address a negative bias expressed by a loved one? Okay. I would ask them, so I'm going to the chat because folks are feeling more comfortable putting things in the chat. I would ask if they have a personal experience with that bias, question why they feel and think the way and open it up to discussion of different perspectives. Okay, I'm also seeing clarifying questions, active listening, conversations about how this bias may be harmful to others, open-ended questions. I've had to tell them I think differently, not less. Okay, ask them for facts, not speculation, and by trying to understand their reasons why and let them know what I observed and asked if they are open to having a conversation about it gentleness. Okay, someone mentioned gentleness. And it looks like patience and education, and try to understand their perspective and experience. I don't accept bias created by others. Okay. Excellent responses. I'll ask why they made that statement. I will try to reframe the statement. Okay. And if someone is not willing to listen or have a conversation, set a boundary and walk away. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I see a lot of folks who are also connecting to that as well. Okay.
If I try to work through a bias that someone has of me, am I not giving that identity or whatever they're saying power? That's something I need to explain. For me, if you creating a label or identity that I don't see for myself, I just don't accept it. That's just the way I handle it.
Okay.
So you can't give me a bias that I will receive personally.
Okay.
And I don't try to explain away a bias if you have one.
Okay.
As a loved one. As a loved one.
Okay.
That's just me. Okay.
Thank you. Brandy?
I think it's important to always get an understanding of why someone has a certain bias. And understand their personal experiences, the reason why. It may have nothing to do with anything, but I think learning can occur when there's understanding. So if there is someone who has a negative bias, first, me understanding why they have that, and then maybe I could help them to have a different perspective of that bias, and just by showing that you understand.
Absolutely. Thank you. I see that there are two other folks who had their hand raised.
Hi, this is Tracy. How are you?
Hi.
I think I take what the gentleman said. Sometimes with family, I think Dick Gregory said it best. Ask yourself, is this person, I'm paraphrasing, is he mentally competent to have this discussion with you without it turning into an argument? Because even though sometimes you want to educate people, you have to really act. For me, I'll keep it on the eye. Is it really worth educating them when they may be stuck and not willing to learn, especially when there's a lot of knowledge out here about various subjects? So for me, I would just say, you have a right to say what you have to say, but I walk away because it's too much energy to put into someone, especially a loved one. It's just too much energy. For me, I'll keep it on the eye.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. And I saw that Yvette, you also had your hand raised.
My biases, my family's, I have a big family. I have 17 grandchildren and 6 great-grand. So there's a lot of biases, a lot of feelings, a lot of stuff. I try to educate them and let them know, that I too have had those feelings and those situations, but I try to make them more open-minded. Like, you have to, you don't have to like everybody, but you have to show some kind of love and respect to people, because we don't know where they come from or what happened to them that they became who they became. And sometimes our perceptions can be wrong because of past experiences of our own. Like, if you've had an experience with a certain person from a certain way of life, you may judge everybody from that same perspective, and you shouldn't do that. And I try to educate them in that way and try to express, but at the end of the day, everybody has their own opinions and their own feelings, and all you could do is give them the information, and what they do with it is on them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it speaks to the motivation, right? Leaning into the motivation around whether or not someone wants to deconstruct that bias, why it's happening, etc. We have time for one more response, but of course, there's still amazing conversation happening in the chat.
Hi, if I may add that regarding education of a loved one, I do agree with the speaker who said momentarily earlier that she would not spend a lot of time and energy on a loved one who may have X amount of biases because it was just too time consuming in terms of energy. And the other speaker who said that um, the biases can be very profound and very deep. And I do agree with that. When I envision educating a loved one on biases, I almost envision it the way that one will have a thought of educating a child of age 5 or 6, or how one may be training a beloved kitten or dog on doing the right thing and the correct way in terms of using a kitty litter box, where you're doing it firmly but with a lot of gentleness. And however, regarding like profound racism and homophobia and those types of things, they are very deep. Unlikely they're going to be changed in a general manner or in a quick manner. However, I still think that it is a good challenge for a person to challenge that kind of individual on the logic of what they are saying in terms of racism or homophobia or whatever the case may be. It is still important to challenge them on their incorrectness. That's what I want to point out.
Excellent. Thank you. So we know that implicit bias is unconscious. We know that we all have it. We all know that at various times it may be activated. We also know that at various times we may need to challenge and push back onto that as much as we feel comfortable in doing so, because we saw the difference between, when once a loved one was involved, how we might push back on that. This is not an easy area to walk, it's not something that we necessarily feel comfortable in talking about, not something that we necessarily feel comfortable in reflecting on, but thinking, continuing to think this through and recognizing when implicit bias is activated, when your unconscious bias is activated, and how it can potentially be coming into the room in your work with clients. Okay, how could potentially be coming into your room with the work with clients. Diana?
So one of the things I wanted to remind us all, that we were just speaking about earlier about cultural humility. Cultural humility indicates that we should self-reflect. And it's not just our values and belief system, but even in school we learn that we need to take a step back when we are working with individuals and with communities, take a step back and look at how our week went. Think about something simple, like just look at, did the interactions, were they helpful? Were we reactive instead of responsive? Did we get defensive at any point? Did we rush a situation and not really elicit information from the individual because we were pressed for some other kind of stressful event that we had to attend? And so these are different things that when we look at our patterns, we have an opportunity for ourselves to look at, oh, wait a minute, I could do that differently, because that's going to affect how I what the outcomes are with that individual, or how responsive they will be for their own process. So, like we as long as we're human, like Dr. Blackwell was saying, we're going to have biases, but we can mitigate some of that. So it's like, take a step back. That's my clinical term. Take a step back, look at what we're doing, and maybe we can seek to improve. It's when we don't do that may be born of concern, because then we're not looking to improve. We can look at any outcome report from different agencies and see how effective we are and how much we're reaching people and how much we're not. So that's part of the impetus there. But we can look at ourselves. So we can do that within the context of what we do as individuals, even stepping away from the agency. That's where cultural humility comes in. Just wanted to mention that. Thanks, Doris.
Thank you. So we are actually at time right now. And so we kind of left on a very heavy subject in regards to something that's going to continue to be something that you're going to reflect on probably this evening and return on Wednesday. But again, like Diana said, this is something that we need to continue to focus on, and how it's impacting our work with clients when it comes into the room, whether it's with clients, whether it's other folks, etc. Okay, So it's something we're going to need to continue to work on. That's some of this unfinished business. Okay. So let me see, where are we? So final thoughts for anyone? And it's okay if folks don't have final thoughts or they're putting them in the chat. Okay. Because this is an ongoing journey. So we will continue with this on Wednesday. I think we have an assignment that you'll be receiving via, or some pre-work that you'll be receiving via email prior to Wednesday.
Can I bring up the slide and you can speak to it?
Yes, you can, please. So the homework that you'll be receiving via email is you're going to be reflecting, going to view and reflect the angry eye video. And so the link is located in the slide, but you'll also receive this via email, and be prepared to discuss that in the training on Wednesday. So we're going to start with that, okay? Also, you're going to receive a couple of handouts. So the social determinants of health, which Diana mentioned a little earlier, we're going to lean into that for our next session. And also you'll receive another handout for your review, covert racism. So the social determinants of health and covert racism, we're asking that you please review them and have them available during the training. And also please take the time to look at the angry eye video and be prepared to discuss it when we start on Wednesday. Okay. So thank you everyone for being a part of this conversation today. Again, this continues to be a part of our journey. We will definitely continue to have unfinished business. The next time we will meet is March 27th. Time is flying by. We'll start at 9:30 a.m. and we'll continue the journey together. Okay? So please have a great rest of the day. And I think also as a reminder, please add your first name and your last name to the chat if you didn't do so at the beginning, so that we can make sure that your attendance is taken, and we will see you on Wednesday.
And all of the names for those who shared the monitor and there were more than one people at certain places, please put all those names in there. Nice participation. Good folks. Thank you.
Thank you.